Mr. Breen, you arrived in Korea in 1982.
I did.
And I've asked other people in the past about what did Korea smell like in the past? What was the food like? What was the weather like? But what I want to ask you about to start with this is, I've never lived in a non-democratic country. I've this is my privilege, I guess, but I grew up in the south of England and then in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. But I've never inhabited a place where it was not a democracy. And at that time, I guess we would call South Korea not a democracy. I'm not sure, but that's where I want to try to start with this. Is there anything that we need to know? Did it feel like inhabiting a non-democracy, or are they just these ideological terms and on the ground level they don't really mean anything?
Well, it's interesting that you put it like that. I mean, it's a bit of both in a way, like most things, in that what I'm sure if you ask people this question, people who are here in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, 80s, the thing that will change will be the economics and social conditions. You said at the beginning, the smell of the country. Well, you probably heard real old-timers say that Korea used to have this smell.
Which
of
smell?
The night soil, because they used to put human waste on the on the soil, not in the cities, but and that this smell, once you got out of Seoul, became pervasive. Although I suspect that's got exaggerated a bit in the telling. The other smell from the old time. So I'm putting myself in a position of asking somebody who was here 40 years before me.
Yeah.
And the other smell was the yontan, the what do you call it?
Charcoal briquettes?
The charcoal, the briquette smell and that sort of thing. So, but by the time I came, it seems, if the economic development began sort of in the early to mid 60s, so we assume that before that we're dealing with a largely agricultural, rural type country and probably a bit rough at the edges in the city. Then 1982 seems pretty close to that, but actually it was more like it is today.
Wow.
At least for me, because I was living in, I don't know if you know the Jamsho apartments, the Odanji, which is the they still exist.
Oh wow.
So I was living there, coming on the subway, line number 2, which had been open for a year or two, which still exists.
How many subway lines were there, roughly?
There was 1, 2, and 3 and 4, I think, were under construction then.
That's quite a lot.
There were these big metal plates in the road right downtown for number 4, 3 and 4, I guess. And coming into Seoul, a lot of the buildings have changed, but was not unrecognizable. And so, but to the question of democracy, this is interesting. I was a journalist when I was here. So as a journalist, you're dealing mostly with political type stuff because you're covering the whole country. I wrote for an American paper at first. So for an American audience,
covering the Wall Street Journal?
Washington Times.
Washington Times, sorry.
And, no one's interested in, well, there wasn't K-pop or K-beauty or anything. No one's really interested in that, although the annual feature story you could write that would probably get more interest than all the political stories would be kimchi making. That seemed to get to the audience.
Okay.
So most of us, the small band of foreign correspondents, most foreign correspondents are Korean. Actual foreigners are about half a dozen of us. That was it. So nobody spoke Korean. And one person did. I tell a lie. And so for us, we were mainly looking at politics and stuff. And the big story, the ongoing thing, was we didn't call it that then, but it was democratization. It was student demos because these were a symptom of the lack of democracy. There was other stories like the Olympic Games. Olympic Games were coming up in '88. So even from '82, Everything was sort of focused towards the Olympics. But then the moment we say democracy came was in June 29th, 1987. But it was a tweak of the Constitution. So you could get up that morning, miss the news, carry about your normal day, and someone says, oh, you know, democracy's all right. Oh, is it? You know, it's not like it's some thunderous thing. It was a tweak, but I say the way I saw this as a reporter was because it was politics. No, what am I trying to say here? If you were a Korean engaged in your life and that didn't really involve politics, you wouldn't sort of be turning around saying, "Oh, my country's a dictatorship." You wouldn't experience it like that necessarily. In fact, just to add to the this sort of long drawn-out response, make it more confusing, is Korea perceived itself as a liberal democracy.
In the 80s period?
Yeah, well, I think from Syngman Rhee, actually it was more democratic under Syngman Rhee, even when the military dictatorships came in. So from 61 until 87, there was two military dictatorships. They referred to themselves as liberal democracies. So, but they knew they weren't. But they weren't sort of lying. It was an aspiration, and also a desire to follow in the American footsteps and also please the Americans. But I think the wisdom was, yeah, we're a democracy. We want democracy, but we're not really ready for it yet. That was how the dictatorship viewed it because of North Korea. So. And as I say, so all that sort of all this liveliness of Korea that you see now on the street, it was different then because the economic level was different and people thought in a different way. But basically, that was still there. Whereas if you go up to North Korea in the street, everybody's quiet, because they don't want anyone to listen to what they're talking about. They're careful about how they talk. So that sort of dictatorship is a different type of dictatorship. South Korea was never quite like that. However, if you stepped in for a Korean, if you stepped into the North Korea arena, you had an opinion on North Korea, then you had to be careful. That's where dictatorial behavior really justified itself and manifested and justified itself. You know, so anyone who's suspected of being a North Korean spy would get quite brutally treated. I mean, not that was publicized, but you find out later. And the people doing the brutal treatment thought they were doing the patriotic thing. You know, it was justified. So, but then, as I say, when democracy came, the particular tweak was that the dictator Chun Doo-hwan, everyone thought he wouldn't step down, but it was obviously he was going to. And on June the 10th of that year, 87, the ruling party formally anointed. There was a big ceremony at the Jamsil gymnasium, I think it was. No Tae-yu, who was his sort of closest friend and fellow military coup maker, former general, to be their party's candidate for the election. And so it was at that point that Koreans, I say Koreans in general, I mean most of the people, thought they forgot that the big gripe was that he's never going to step down. They kind of quickly accepted that, but now we know who our next dictator is, you know. And so that's when the protests erupted. You'll find student protesters from that time and politicians who were young then take credit for it, but actually the opposition, political opposition, were a spent force by then. the students were useless, frankly. I don't believe they contributed much towards democratization. That's an unpopular opinion, but they were too far on the left. And they were just tolerated and kind of ignored by the older generation because rattling the dictatorship cage was useful. What happened was an association of religious and social leaders called for protests. Who exactly these people were, they never really stepped forward and identified themselves and took credit for it.
Right.
So the usual students came out to protest. They jumped on this. But then ordinary people came out. That was a big difference.
Yeah.
And when the government realized it was a middle-class revolution, then they gave in. So it lasted for 3 weeks. And by the way, what the protesters wanted was Korea at that time had an American-style electoral college system. You know, the systems where in America, when you vote in the presidential election, you're not actually voting for the president. You're voting, well, let me put it this way. There are electors from your state go to an electoral college.
Yeah.
And in theory, they can change the result. In practice, they don't. But in theory, they could. Korea had a similar system. There were 5,000 electors who not only in theory could change the result, would have. That's what everybody felt. It was just not trusted.
Right.
So all the protests were for a direct election as opposed to this indirect method. And on June the 29th, it was agreed. And so the election then was Korea's first democratic election. And guess who won?
No Tae-yu.
Well, but that's another story. But
he seemed to win fair and square, though. There wasn't too much talk of it being, from what I understand. Sorry.
Well, there was a claim, quite widely believed, that there was some kind of fraud took place. And I mean, I'm sure there was on the fringes there was something, but it never stood up. The real explanation that people, I think, accepted was that the opposition split the vote.
Yeah.
3 of them ran, particularly the 2, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Yong-sam, could not. I think each felt that if they had deferred to the other, that would have been the end of them.
Yeah.
So they would rather risk the dictator winning. So this is why you find a lot of people do not accept that No Tae-yu was the first democratically elected president because he had been a soldier and all of that. They think Kim Yong-sam was.
Yeah.
And some people don't even accept him because he went over to the ruling party in order to win.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
I've got so many questions. I want to come to those religious leaders you mentioned, but before that, was there much support for the Chun dictatorship presidency? So you said that, not everybody was thinking about politics. Some people were just going about their lives, and you mentioned that perhaps Korea viewed itself as a liberal democracy, or at least with aspirations to, perhaps relative to the North. Were there people that you met in Korea at that time that were like, well, it's doing all right, we're not too bad, we don't hate the government? Was there any support for it? Because it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, oh, everyone was opposed to it. But was there any?
Well, everyone was not opposed to it. I think there's a difference between Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. I think for Park Chung-hee there was genuine affection and support because he was a revolutionary. I mean, he transformed this country, no question. And even people who suffered under him, like Kim Dae-jung, came to acknowledge that. Chun Doo-hwan arrived. It was like a mistake. It just felt unnecessary. So people tolerated it. Why? Because don't forget 5,000 years of dictatorship, in a sense. I mean, in other words, no history of democracy to speak of. So the people who gave their lives up to work with the opposition and fight for democracy were considered, and sometimes even considered themselves to be sort of losers. What is the point? And so, but around 1986, I think it was 1986, there was, what happened was when Chunduwan came in 1980, politicians were all put on a blacklist. Then over a period, people were removed from the blacklist. And then by 1986, there was parliamentary, National Assembly elections, which the opposition they had a fake opposition. They used to call them opposition by day, ruling party by night, or the other way around, I forget.
It's quite nice though.
But, who were sort of ruling party people in an opposition. Anyway, they weren't really, they were there to give the appearance of opposition, but they weren't really opposition. But then the real opposition was allowed to run for that election and did very well in a very short time. That started to change the atmosphere. And I noticed then the people who I thought were just sort of pro-government, or because I'm a foreigner,
right,
and because I'm a journalist, you forget. A journalist forgets. A journalist thinks they're an ordinary person. They're not. It's like when someone talks to you, it's like they're talking into a microphone that everybody can hear. You know?
Did you have one of those bands on that I sometimes see? Did you?
Yeah.
Really? What did it say?
Kija, Wishing Kija.
Okay.
With we had a big issue about that as well, because we found what we found was in some of these demos, we saw people with cameras with these things. I thought, who's that? I don't know. It was actually the photographers reported it to us. We think there's government agents using foreign press. So we, I was the president of the Foreign Press Club at that time.
Okay.
So we took a delegation along to the government, complain about this, and also to let them know that we were making our own armbands that had SFC, the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club, with the members' number. And we gave them out to the members and said, under no circumstances can you give this to somebody else.
Okay.
Otherwise you lose it. That's it. So we were also a bit strict. And we had this, 4 of us went over and had this meeting with a government assistant minister. And he let rip at us. Like, this was the biggest screaming match I've ever been in my life. I mean, it was really unpleasant. And in the end, he gave us a few 4-lettered words in English, and we left. And that was June the 9th. The next day was the day when Notayu was anointed. This is 87. And we all turned up, covered that story. And then that night, when all the riots were on, we all had these things.
Wow.
So that made it difficult for... So that was quite serious, because we had cases of Asian photographers, so either Japanese or Korean, in the foreign press, being assaulted by students who thought they were cops,
government plants or something.
That sort of thing. So we kind of cleaned that problem up just in time for the big protest. I forgot how we got onto that now.
I love your memory of all this, by the way. The dates. And,
well, those are big dates. Normally my memory is shocking.
They are. Was it, you just mentioned the possibility of Asian photographers or something being assaulted. Now, we've both been here for the 2016 protests and impeachments. If we look at those, do we get a sense of those 1987? Do we get a sense of that movement, or is it so fundamentally different you can't compare it?
No.
Was there a sense of violence? How does it?
It's how can I say? There was they're completely different, because I hesitate to call these protests violent. They were violent protests, but the violence was either symbolic or specific.
Okay.
In other words, there weren't no shop windows smashed. In fact, I remember seeing in some of these demos, if an ambulance was coming through, the students would just sort of. I mean, these are students, by the way. These are sort of the young elite. I mean, they weren't necessarily wealthy people. They weren't wealthy, but they were people who were doing what they were doing. And I'm talking about the student protests here rather than the bigger one is where everyone joined in.
Yeah.
But the student ones, they were sacrificing themselves, jeopardizing their own future for the sake of the country. So they were kind of well motivated. They were not smashing windows. They were not turning over cars. They weren't setting fire to things. Even when they got into Molotov cocktails, they used, now I forget what it is. There's one where you use, I think, like petrol, and another where you use kerosene.
Okay.
Now, there's one of them, when you throw it and it lands, it just goes, and then it's out.
Right.
They use that for.
So
the other one,
safer.
it's much safer.
Yeah.
There's a famous photograph of I laugh because it didn't look funny, but there was a famous photo that made the front pages around the world of a protest outside Kongo University in Seoul. And there was, in the background, some riot police, and there was a lady with a handbag literally walking along like this, enveloped in flame. And it was now you imagine, by the way, when I used to go home to England, people treated me as if I'd come from a war zone. And it was because of stuff like this. But if you were there, that thing went, she didn't miss a beat, you know.
Yeah.
Or maybe it sort of went like this or something.
Yeah.
So.
And it was probably more dangerous going down the East End or something when a Chelsea match is on or something.
Well, no, definitely. Yeah. Because it's random, you see.
Yeah.
There was no violence against foreigners. You know, in fact, I had the experience of, I can remember once now in front of the press centre where there were these sort of bollards about, 2 feet off the ground. And there was a student, saw me coming along, a foreigner, jumps up and starts shouting some anti-American slogan, and I'm thinking, well, I was familiar enough with Korea then to know, but, an outsider might think, my God, is he going to whip a knife out and kill him or something, kill me? Or something. And then he jumps down and he just sort of goes like this and then moves on. So it's the same you see here with the anti-Japanese protest. There's
performative?
There's a performative side, which doesn't mean they're not serious. It's a way of expression, knowing that if they start smashing shop windows and burning cars, not only will the government crack down, they'll be slung in jail, but the people will be happy about that. So they're not going to get any support from anybody. However, the effect of seeing having said that the violence was sort of performative in a sense, it was still intense, and it was between police and students. So the police would be firing off tear gas from sort of rifles, shooting them off.
Which has a distinct smell, I've read. I've read reports about the tear gas in summer and things.
Very strong, very strong. I could tell. I had an office in the Seoul Press Center, which is downtown, and if there was a demo at Yonsei, which was, 3 miles away or something, and the wind was coming this way, I could sort of, there's a demo at Yonsei,
Wow.
And so, and the Korean police used very, very strong tear gas. This was stuff that, it's like, if you want to know what it's like if you blow pepper into your face, it's kind of like that. And what you mustn't do is blink your eyes, which is exactly what you want to do. You sort of let the tears run out. And what the students did was they put toothpaste under here, and that sort of helps clear it, and up their nostrils and things. There's other things you can do.
Can you tell me a little bit, sorry to interrupt, but just about the police, because sometimes if you go down to Gwanghwamun today and there's a protest, a lot of the enforcement there seem like very young lads. perhaps doing military service or something.
Yeah.
They don't seem intimidating. No disrespect to them, but they seem kind of young and they're just standing there. When you talk about the police, I can sort of visualize the students, but what are the police like at this time?
They, the police. Okay, I'll answer that and continue describing, and then we'll get to how it's different from the recent one. The police. There were two types. And a lot of them were, as they are now. A lot of them were. Oh, are they now? Young men doing military service.
It seems to be a lot like that when I see them. Yeah.
And you hear stories of a policeman doing his military service, his brothers on the other side chucking stuff at him.
Yeah.
And so you get these guys. These are the ones that they call the Darth Vader. They have all the gear on. And by the way, these South Korean riot police were really good at their job because they didn't intend. They were crowd control, and they didn't intend to hurt people. They didn't intend to catch people necessarily. What they would do if there's a big protest, say in City Hall, is they would block areas off, but then leave an escape route. So they could, and then fire off the tear gas and disperse it. So they were actually very disciplined. But there was another side to them. These were more regular police, and often they wouldn't be in uniform.
Is this chong? Double denim?
Chaps.
No, sorry, go on.
Well, chaps they called them, but I forget what they used to wear now. They weren't just sort of totally incognito. They had some sort of similar clothes on, handed out to them, but they weren't uniforms. And initially, they actually went onto campuses, and their job was to grab people.
Right.
They would identify the leaders. And I think they started to realize that the people at the front throwing things at them were being led. The leaders were at the back.
Yeah.
Like generals,
and
or maybe not. I don't know, but I don't exactly know how they targeted their victims. But they might find if someone they just took a dislike to, they sort of went for him. And then there was a rule they couldn't go onto campus.
Okay.
So those police were there, and then however, the police at the time had a rather a reputation for unpleasantness. And it was not until, in fact, I had a friend, or an acquaintance, I should say. The Korean inside me hesitates because he was older than me.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
Yes.
Who had, it's a long story which I won't go into, but he had basically been to, the year before I met him, he'd been to a fortune teller for some reason.
They do like fortune tellers here. Still,
for a business reason. A fortune teller he'd been to before, and he knew a relative of this fortune teller. He there was nobody there. He walked around the sides, no one there, so he left. That night, he gets picked up by the police. There are 3 bodies in the house. The fortune teller and 2 relatives had been murdered.
Wow.
And the police knew he'd been there because he had called a cousin and said, "Oh, she's not there. Do you know where she?
Yeah.
I've been there." But so she must have told the police.
Oh wow.
And he was held in a hotel room, naked, for about 12 days, thrashed. And he said, "I was getting to the point where I would have confessed to anything just to get off." And then he was suddenly let go, and it turned out that the cousin, who was a woman. She got the same treatment, and her thing became a case. So it sort of stopped. So in other words, until like the mid-'80s, that was normal. You get a suspect for something, you soften them up. So the police, the professional police, if you like, had that reputation. But anyway, back to the demos. What happens? So the students are throwing, they break up paving stones and they throw stones and things. So you can get hurt by one of these things. And Molotov cocktails. The riot police have shields fending things off and are firing tear gas. And any real injuries and things like that are accidents, you know. Although I remember once seeing at Myeongdong Cathedral, seeing riot police levelling the tear gas horizontally at the student.
Oh, so this way is meant to
It's
just be more
supposed to go
signalling.
like that, and, and it sort of drops. It's not meant to hit anybody. But somebody must have got frustrated or something, because I think that wasn't in the rule book.
That was Lee Han-yeol as well, the Yonsei student.
That was a different case, but that's what happened to him.
Yeah.
He got hit by one. And anyway, so those protests, and then the 1987 protests that the middle class joined, if you like. What tended to happen, there'd be big sort of protests, and then when they would, the bankers would go home or something, then the hardcore, the students, would then start fighting with the police, like that. That's sort of how it went. And there was, I forget when it was relatively recently, but by the time of the 2016 protests, the protests now come from the political left.
Yeah.
The left changed its game and realized that violence isn't winning them any friends. So the protests against Park Geun-hye, I mean, people brought their children, they had kids on people's shoulders and prams and stuff like that. And I think also there's credit to, you know, often these sort of protests historically get more violent because the police are too tough. And you see, in a dictatorship, you sort of feel that you're not familiar with somebody having a right to protest, which they are now. You know, I walk past some things, you see somebody with a protest thing outside of a ministry. A generation or two ago, that would have inflamed the authorities. It's sort of like heresy.
It's not very Confucian either to like speak to power like that. You're meant to bow and
exactly. It's where's the deference? Hey, I'm the government. You know? Now people accept that, and so the protests they can be large and vigorous, but there's you know, they're of a different nature.
Right.
You know?
Did you, when you went to these protests, you mentioned students would put toothpaste maybe under their cheekbones or something like this. Did you have to prepare something? Like, did you get a yellow pages and put it inside your shirt to make sure? I don't know. I have no idea. Did you have to physically prepare, or was it just I got my notepad, my pen, and my balls of steel, and off I go with my armband or with my number?
Well, no, it's more embarrassing than that.
Keep this a little bit closer if you can, please.
Okay, it's because
that's fine.
You know, I was a print reporter, so the real heroes of this on the media side are the cameramen and you know, the video cameramen and the still photographers.
Right.
They have to get right up front.
Okay.
And
so you're the general's back, like the students.
Excuse me. Well, even worse than that. In 1987, the center of the center of the action was Myeongdong Cathedral, because the police would definitely not go onto cathedral grounds, and you know, Catholic Church has a history of providing refuge and so on. Yeah. So it was in front of the church where a lot of that was happening. So Myeongdong was the center of a lot of the protests, and I found myself a rather nice. There weren't many nice coffee shops in those days, but I found a nice one on the second floor of the road going up to the cathedral, about 100 yards down. Second floor. I could actually watch from the window without feeling the tear gas.
Yeah, that's
you know?
Perfect. Was Myeongdong a foreign place then? But now it's associated with foreign tourism. But what was it like? Was it a place in the 80s? Was it a shopping centre?
A big shopping area. Yeah. Not dissimilar to what it is now, because those buildings remain the same. A lot of them.
No.
You know. So I didn't prepare in that way. I did at one point that for some reason it was illegal to have a gas mask. Some reporters got gas masks, but they were you could get them somewhere up Uljiro or somewhere in one of these shops somewhere. Yeah. You could get them, but technically they were illegal. Some reporters had them. I remember seeing a Washington Post reporter visiting from Japan. A lot of the American papers and European papers are based in Japan, sitting outside the Chosen Hotel on a wall with his laptop going like this with a gas mask on. It's sort of, these are some of the images I have of that time, Wow. And but the protests are very different now.
You mentioned at one stage that rather than being, I think you said it wasn't so much the students, but there was this religious groups that pushed it. Now, you've just mentioned the cathedral in Myeongdong. There's lots of different religious groups here in South Korea.
Yeah.
And I've read about it before, by the way, and that sort of involvement. I haven't read about this specific part before, but that involvement of religious groups in Korean history, whether it's from the Gabo reforms or the 1919 Samhaelundong, the March 1st, there's always been that legacy, I think. Was it Buddhist? Was it Christian? Was it Catholic? Protestant? Did you get any sense of what it was?
To be honest, I don't know. As I say, I regret this now because I think they were important, but there was very little interest on the part of the foreign press. Once the protests, it's a little bit like the protests against Park Geun-hye. It was only later that I realized these were very well organized and they were funded. And you're thinking, okay, who's doing that? Well, I think it might have been the trades union. I don't know who it was, but there's some real opposite. It's not just some. Whereas the press, Western press can often romanticize these things too much. You feel like, it's the spontaneous expression of the people. Well, excuse me. No, somebody has organized the spontaneous expression of the people. Maybe a lot of people have joined it spontaneously, but so there was never any interest. So I in who that committee. I'd have to look it up. I'm sure in the Korean press. I'm sure they covered it. But the Catholic Church, the Christian community was kind of divided as the country was. As I say, everybody would want democracy. But the North Korean threat, everyone then had experienced the Korean War.
Yeah.
So this was no joke. This was no sort of ideological right-wing type of fantasy. This was from people's lives. They knew this. The threat of North Korea is very real, and we have to tolerate certain things in order to be protected from that threat.
Yeah.
It's American troops, American presence, in those is if you don't like having to sort of kowtow to the Americans for everything, this is the price you're paying for this protection, so to speak. Then as the country develops, that relationship with America changes,
Yeah.
But also it's the leadership you have is you want someone who can protect you against that. So the churches and I don't know where the Buddhists fell on this, but the Christian churches were definitely divided on this. So you would get some who would emphasize, well, in other words, the religious vote was split.
Okay.
But the Catholic Church did play a big role, and the Catholic cardinal at that time, Cardinal Stephen Kim, was probably the most. I'm just thinking, like now, if you would say who is the most respected sort of leader, social leader in this country now, who's not a politician, not a business person, it's hard to say.
Head of the COVID-19 response, her name is JoongAng. She eventually went very grey, but she seemed to be well respected. I'm not sure if she's a leader as such, but
okay, people like that would be appreciated for I'm thinking more in terms of justice, human rights, and who is it you turn to? The Bishop Tutu,
Yeah.
So he was that person.
Beyond the fray
Yeah.
of politics.
And
Yeah, okay.
he was careful to be nuanced as well. He wasn't like, but some priests were more radical. And then a lot of people became Catholics for political motives because the Catholic Church provided refuge, Yeah.
And eventually, lots of presidents would be Catholic, whether it's Kim Dae-jung or President Moon Jae-in.
Moon Jae-in's Catholic, Kim Dae-jung. I think they're the only ones. Lee Seung-man was a Methodist. Park Chung-hee, I think, was Buddhist. I'm not sure what.
I'm not sure what Park Chung-hee was. I think he was just a soldier.
No, not sure what he was. Chun Doo-hwan was a Buddhist, I think, if anything.
He did like 3 years of penance in a Jeondeung-sa temple, I believe, out in Gangwon-do.
Yeah.
I've seen that room where he stayed in.
Yeah.
It's yeah. You mentioned North Korea, and so these days there's so many videos about this on YouTube of people going around Seoul like with a vlog asking young people, are you scared of North Korea? And then South Korean people are like, I want a nice Americano, like where's the coffee shop? And I'm doing Instagram. There's not a great big fear actually of North Korea in South Korea today, and I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but in that period you would have the memories of the Korean War, I guess, would have still been there. You would have had the 83 bombing in Rangoon, the commando raids in the late 60s. Was there, and I would imagine as well, and please correct me when I'm wrong, but there would have been less known about North Korea at that time.
Oh, definitely.
Because now we can see inside. We have all the images, the social media. What was the... Was there like a fear? Was there this mystery, enigma, romanticism about it? Or did it seem scary?
Yeah, it was. There was definite fear of North Korea, and that was in part obviously because of the experience of the Korean War. It was also because of the whole posture of government at the time is to. Because this is what we're protecting you against. So there's the propaganda, and I remember once going to the unification ministry, and I said, "Oh, can I have a look at some North Korean books and stuff?" Because they had this little sort of library. Yeah. And I remember now. Bear this in mind. I'm approaching this not in a religious way. I'm just as a journalist. But I'd lived in Korea for a few years by then. And I go into this room and I almost feel like unclean. I don't know how to explain it. It's almost like a Christian going into the Church of Satan or something. There was a feeling that even the red and black imagery and stuff like that. Yeah. Now, you see, in time, that whole impression, people would laugh at that now. Because that's all gone. So the fear of North Korea now is more where it is. It's more of a realistic one. Whereas before it was the bogeyman. It was a fear of something that was unknown and some mysterious evil that, my parents told me about and this and that, So,
horns and beyond the reality or something into a mystical.
Yeah. So... Yeah, they were literally like kids in the school in the late 50s and in the 60s. I mean, I knew people who told me, when I was at kindergarten, elementary school, I actually thought North Koreans had horns. That's what they told us. Because the language in which they were referred to was that sort of imagery. These people are evil. And so that has taken a while, but I think that's gone. So the fear of North Korea, the military fear is, this doesn't mean North Korea is not a threat, but the nature of the threat is more rationally appreciated, if you like, I think.
Now we're talking about missiles and capabilities and island chains and where they can strike, because we see Tae-man Kim Jong-un, his family, his daughter, and things like this, rather than just being not quite really sure what they look like to a certain extent. And that's definitely a good change, I think.
I think it's a very good change, and it allows South Korea to respond and deal with North Korea in a way that is in accordance with its own values, rather than sort of a tit for tat or two sides that see themselves as equals. This is what allows South Korea. South Korea knows it has to behave as appropriately as a democracy towards this horrendous country.
Yeah.
Whereas before, it was literally like, you're fighting Satan. So.
And that, what's the word? Reluctance is the restraint. When you see the sinking of the Seoul, the bombing of Yongbyon, and no visible retaliation for the loss of South Korean lives, and whether that's President Obama on the phone saying, get your planes down, or whatever the stories are. But it's always surprised me, that restraint, because I go through it sometimes in some of my presentations, the let's call them sometimes atrocities, that North Korea has carried out. And, sometimes an astute student will raise their hand and go, what did South Korea do in return? And well, maybe they didn't do anything, or maybe they did and it's swept under. But I think you make a very interesting point, that it needs to respond according to its own values rather than tit for tat.
But I think, interestingly, there will come a point where they might respond in a way that surprises us. I think when I say responding in their own values, I'm thinking of things like, why shouldn't we be able to read the Nodong Shinmun or the Pyongyang Times in South Korea?
Yeah.
Our value, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and there was always this, the government basically never trusted its own people. And always gave North Korea probably greater credit than they're due, but it's difficult to judge, for their ability to sway people and to send in spies and manipulate people and set up things. That's obviously happened over the years. We don't know the extent to which it's happening now. But the government has this is why you never want sort of military intelligence types being the president of a country, because then, they will
think about that stuff.
They will set stuff up according to what they know, whereas in fact you've got to put that in its place. There's always a risk there. But what I'm saying about democratic values is more how we treat our own people.
Yes.
In relation, So, but I think the retaliation thing. Definitely in the early days, the Americans stopped them. And with Rangoon, I'm not sure if I seem to recall that the Americans were very, very concerned that the Chunjuan was going to retaliate. And then when the ambassador went over to the Blue House or met him off the plane or whatever it was, found that that's not what was in his mind. So I think the Koreans now don't need the Americans say, don't retaliate. They've actually been very soft over the years, particularly in the last 20 years, because they want to keep this, they want to keep some kind of dialogue or something going. But I think, there are people also who realize that North Korea is a country that understands the punch in the face. And is rather contemptuous of the pretty words. Yeah. So if they tried something under this government, I wouldn't be surprised because the rules of engagement have changed. One thing with not the Sewolo, the Chonan?
The Chonan.
The
ship in 2010.
Yeah,
it was
2010 is that the rules of engagement were such that the local the officer on the ground was very limited to what they could do, and the proper retaliation had to go up a long way. So by the time that sort of came back down again, it would be too late. So I think the rules have changed on that, so to allow greater leeway to the local commanders, if something happens.
And it seems, I've heard reports of the current government, the Conservative President Yoon Suk-yeol government, moving to allow reading of the Nodong Shinmun and things like that. I'm not sure if that's political posturing or maybe it's, well, let's read it and then we can see what they are really saying about it, rather than...
The ironic thing is that you think if they let everybody have total free access, that would probably convert the few diehards.
Yeah.
Because North Korea does not present itself very well.
No.
You know.
No, it doesn't. And I don't think if I've always advocated for us to be able to watch the vlogs that it makes, because YouTube and Google have banned a lot of these North Korean produced North Korean vlogs where it's a woman walking around a department store in Pyongyang and they've said that's government propaganda. You're not allowed to show that or make money from it. But I've always wanted to see them, to see how North Korea
like.
And I don't worry that I'm going to start goose stepping around the place saying Kim Song Manse or something. You know, I have faith in my ability, and I think governments should have a little bit more faith in us like that. Yeah. You mentioned South Korean values, and we always need to just acknowledge and recognize the wonderful transformation this country has done, through its people, and the fact that you and I can have these conversations like this and we can talk about all manner of things.
Yeah, we're not afraid someone's going to burst through the door and, say, what are you guys doing?
Absolutely, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And there are many places in the world that are not like that, and some places are like that and they go backwards, so that should be acknowledged. In terms of South Korean democracy, and I know you've spoken about it at various points, I think history matters. How you achieve democracy, what you were before a democracy, the culture of the country. Because we might say that Britain is a democracy, France is a democracy, Argentina, and we could go all around the world, and then we come to South Korea, but the democracies would always be a little bit different, are they? Do they manifest differently? So I think what I'm trying to ask you here, Mike, is there something specific or unique about South Korean democracy as it's manifest? And you've been here to witness that transformation. Or is it, no, David, it's just democracy like back home in Dover or something?
Right. Well, I think democracy is a broad, what do you call it, church? No?
That works. Yeah. It's a wide temple.
It's a wide temple.
It's a voluptuous mosque.
There you go. And it comes in different shapes, but democracy basically means the people ruled by the people. Yeah. Usually for practical reasons, usually through institutions, representative government. And so in that regard, Korea is in the family of democracies. There are other countries like North Korea call themselves democratic, but the concept is different. Yeah. It's democratic in the the leader represent the people. That's what makes it democratic. So there's a different. We should have another word for that, really. Well, we do have a few words. But I hesitate to say that Koreans is unique because I'm not sufficiently familiar with other countries. But one thing about democracy in this country is I think there's more emphasis on the democratic part than on the Republican part. In that, or should I say, there's more emphasis on the people part than on the institutions.
The institution being the Republican part, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I'm characterizing this right, that for example, the institutions of democracy being the courts, the media, the National Assembly, elections, and things like that. Whereas the consent of the people to be ruled by these institutions. So in Britain, for example, we've long had a representative democracy. And one thing that's interesting about ours is that originally the people who were allowed to vote or allowed to stand for Parliament were the landed gentry, and so they own land around the country, and therefore the power is around the whole country,
geographically dispersed.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
And these people sort of come to London to represent in theory, their constituents and argue for. So from Aberdeen, they'd be arguing about the fishing interests, this sort of thing. Whereas in a lot of Asian countries, everything piles into the capital.
Yes.
So, sorry, I went off on a tangent then. But
you from Aberdeen?
No.
Okay.
Actually,
that was a tangent.
my father's from Dundee.
Okay.
But
Dundee is jam, jute, and journalism.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's centralised here, you were saying.
Yeah, it's very centralised here. And so, but also, I think this is a weakness of Korean democracy, that the institutions are weak. I think in the 2006, we can talk about this later if you like, but the 2016 impeachment of Park Geun-hye, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was the president, represented a failure of institutions. And a deference to the 1 million people who came out and protested, as if they were running the country. But actually, in a democracy, they don't run the country. It's not practical.
Yeah.
They get to elect people every few years, so they consent and they can change. But there's a system that allows for that. So the street is not the place where that happens. However, so I think that's a weakness of Korean democracy. And part of that is, I think what's happened is the two things, I think. One is that the country used to be ruled by a strong authoritarian leadership forever. And the culture was like that as well, an authoritarian type of culture. So the authoritarian has moved away. There's a vacuum now. And into this vacuum has moved this idea of the people. So the government is very, very responsive to the people.
Very responsive. Yeah.
You get negative articles in the newspaper and all sorts of things happen. Whereas in other countries they might go, is this true? So, I don't know. Well, who cares? Well, people care. But it goes as a sort of, the public opinions polls say this. Okay, right. Here, it's almost as if they're giving instructions,
Yeah.
There was an example of this when Kim Jong-sam was flying to the U.S. to meet Clinton.
Early 90s?
Yeah, early 90s. To discuss something to do with North Korea. I forget what it was. But there's always a difference in approaching North Korea. Sometimes the Americans want to do it and the Koreans don't. Sometimes it's the other way. And the story goes that Kim Jong-sam read The Chosen Ilbo on the plane on the way over, and by the time they landed, changed his position.
Oh, wow.
And the Americans were furious because you don't do that with summits,
Yeah.
And so that's the power of the press, very, very strong, because it is seen to represent the people. But I think it's because this is what's moved into the vacuum, this sense, this is what democracy means. Now, that may change. The other reason for it, I think, is that, institutions tend towards corruption, like hierarchies, if you like. Institutions is the wrong word. Hierarchies, when people have power, over time, they tend towards corruption. And the Koreans in their modern history have really felt that badly, really badly. They've had, just 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the king, who ruled for 600 years, gave the country away to a foreign power without a struggle.
Yeah. That's a very interesting way of describing the Joseon. That's fantastic.
This is why there isn't a single person, well, there might be one, who ever has said since 1945 that they want the monarchy back, because these people were useless.
Yeah.
And the National Assembly has been corrupt. The reason, the reason that the military was welcomed by a generation or accepted, it wasn't that, these are horrible, brutish soldiers who come in to bully us. No, these were the best trained, most patriotic, self-sacrificial people around. The civilian politicians were crooks. So people haven't forgotten that, and so on. So the institutions haven't exactly been worth sort of relying on.
Yeah.
Haven't sort of been good enough to rely on. So that's another reason that there's this idea is the people rule. So if there is a distinction in the Korean democracy from others, and as I say, there may be other democracies like this, it's that sort of emphasis on this part, I think,
This is fantastic, Mike. Let's try and play this out. So I can give, I think, 2 examples of where I think there's public sentiment, you call it. I believe Isabella Bird or Matt Van Valkenburg would call it the gusts of popular feeling.
Yeah.
In Korean, 민심.
Minshim.
Yeah, something like that. One way I see it play out in the modern South Korea is that the government will make an announcement that it's going to make an announcement about something.
Right.
Oh, so we're going to announce something about the minimum wage next week. And they're just testing the waters to see what so they make an announcement about an announcement to gauge the feeling, to gauge the temperature, and then they'll respond accordingly. Another one that I find fascinating is when journalists or people might ask a politician or a president about something related to, a hot button issue like abortion or gay marriage or something like this, and the leader will come back and say, we need to have national consensus first. Now we use this term 시기상조, which means it's premature, it's not the time. And so it's interesting that it's not based on a principle or a law. It's we need to get national consensus first. We need that public sentiment before we move forward with it. I see that quite a lot here, actually. And I have been inclined to think, well, that's kind of good, isn't it? It's not the way, or should it be? No, it should be the principle. We shouldn't rely on this tyranny of the majority. And
it's good in a sense that I think there's this sort of Confucian echo of harmony in society is desirable. It's good from that point of view.
Yeah.
It's also that, despite what I said a minute ago about the rule by the people, actually, the government rules. And
in what way? How
manipulates the people. I mean, the decisions are made by government. For example, I mean, it's a bit of an old one, but we could apply it to now, I suppose, is when the Berlin Wall fell, 1989, whenever it was, was it 1989? The South Korean government sent a team to Bonn, which was the capital then, or where the embassy was then.
Okay.
To spend a year in research and see how it worked, unification.
Yeah.
And they came back and said,
no, don't do it. Yeah.
And at the time, if you asked any Korean about, what the aspiration for the country was, it's unification. And the government, I heard this in government in about 92, I think it was. Assistant Foreign Minister told me about this. And I wrote this in my book. I had a coffee with him. He actually later became the first ambassador to China. And I was chatting with him before I went up to North Korea once. And he said, we don't want unification. I said, what? And he said, can I speak off the record? Because we were talking about North-South reconciliation or something. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll put my notebook down. Put my notebook down.
There's nothing going on here.
And he said, he was like treating me like a kid, He said, we, Koreans, do not want unification with North Korea. And I said, really? He said, yeah. And he went on to say, we can't handle it economically, socially, stuff like that. But if you want to ask me on the record for my opinion, please do. So I said, okay, so what about unification? He said, well, we Koreans want unification, but we prefer to do it in a steady, step-by-step way.
Yeah.
What they were introducing was the Chomjinjuik, which is the, what's the word? Anyway, step-by-step unification, as opposed to Hupsutongil, which is the sudden absorption of North Korea, which had been the assumption until then.
All right. And
so there's an example of how the entire population would be thinking one thing. The government goes, uh-oh, we need to change. Within about 3 years, this was normal thinking through the country. Everybody bought this, and there was no dramatic speech or dramatic moment when it was, I think it was just injected. Probably the media was briefed, and then there were articles and columns and things like that, and people started to realize that absorbing, not taking on North Korea would be too difficult. It would have to be gradual, and gradualism, that's what they call it. So in a similar way, now we say that people aren't interested in North Korea. But they could be made to be interested again if circumstances change. So that's what I mean. The government isn't some passive actor here. It pretends to be passive, but it has to sufficiently pay attention to the people via the media, via netizen commentary, via online street protests and stuff like that, to take what people think into account for the purpose of harmony. Let's get back to what you were saying.
Harmony does seem to be important here, and whether it's don't rock the boat, keep everybody on side, and stop fighting. And this is a tangent, but as somebody such as you, Mike, that's worked in media for a long time and now sort of communications and things like that, from people outside the media, there is this idea amongst some that the media constructs narratives. It's all, and they shift public opinion and things like this. It could be a bit tinfoil hat, this idea. But so I want to ask you, as somebody that's been inside the media, is the media able to shift, drive, and put out these ideas that will then become commonplace? Does the media have that much sway, or is it just like people riding into the wind and hoping to catch something?
I think certain media, like Chosun Ilbo, are very, very influential. And
this is very right-wing.
Yeah.
Is it? You describe it for me, sorry. Some people might not know.
I mean, this is a whole nother subject. What does it mean, right-wing, conservative? We use these terms so freely now.
It's not a pejorative. It's not a bad term to be right-wing.
No, but I mean, it's bad if you see yourself as liberal or left, then it is right wing. That's enough. So if I say this is a right wing newspaper, that's enough for a lot of people to say, well, then it's rubbish. Yeah. However, having said that, it's a right. Most Korean media are kind of center right-ish. There's a couple. I'm talking about the main newspapers now. Television, don't worry about television for a moment. But there's a couple of newspapers, as you know, on the political left.
Hangure would be the big one, I guess.
JoongAng Shinmun. And the further right, I think, have gone into YouTube.
Yes.
And I think what happened there was the Chosun Ilbo let them down over the Park Geun-hye impeachment. They were having Blue House and Chosun Ilbo were having their own struggle. And so when she got into trouble, they saw no virtue in saving her. So the Chosun Ilbo is very influential. And I don't think that's necessarily government saying, oh, would you like to put this column? It's. I think they are an independent institution in that sense. So it's a complex picture, and the media has its own difficulties, particularly financial, where a lot of I don't think the media in this country serves the people very well. they have such financial difficulty that a lot of the content you see, particularly on business, is paid for directly or indirectly, so therefore has very little value. You know, but that's another theme.
There's a lack of trust in media when I look at statistics and things like that. A lot of Korean people don't seem to trust the media. And people don't trust the media everywhere, but relative to other countries, there seems to be a high level of distrust. You've a couple of times you've mentioned this impeachment of Park Geun-hye, and we got there with public sentiment and media. So maybe if we just touch on this for a minute, because I know you've spoken about it in the past at the Royal Asiatic Society and things like this. Just to give you one insight is that if I, and I have done this, I've asked young university students, intelligent people that I teach at Hanyang and Seoul Women's University, like, what is Park Geun-hye in jail for? They don't know. They're just like, she's a, I mean, you would understand if it was murdering civilians or citizens or something like that, God forbid. But what her crime is a little bit difficult for some people to point out, and they would have this feeling that yes, she's a bad person, she should be in jail, but the crime for which she should be in jail, I've often seen people sort of have this cognitive dissonance or realize that they don't know what she's meant to be. It was 27 years or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, originally it was 33 or something.
Essentially a death sentence, wasn't it? It was the sentence itself, whether she would spend all that, but it was essentially saying...
part of it was they knew she wouldn't. This is part of the game.
It's performative again, isn't it? It's
So how do we get into this theme? You mean what was she in jail for? Or
well, I mean, you've brought it up a couple of times in terms of this public sentiment, and we talked about it in democracy and the way these protests come about. And so you've talked about South Korea is more based on the people than the Republican side, the institutions. And so I guess you would see this impeachment of ex-President Park Geun-hye in 2016, 2017 as a reflection of Korean democracy, but also perhaps a weakness of Korean democracy, where I don't want to put words in your mouth, I apologize.
I see it primarily as a failure of institutions. Because what actually happened, you remember, is Park Geun-hye was very unpopular.
Yeah.
However, the pattern of popularity was normal. In other words, since democracy, Korean president serves a single 5-year term. Everyone has been very popular at the beginning. In fact, in the first 2 or 3 elections, people who voted for somebody else often felt, it's like I picked the wrong horse. My guy lost, rather than feeling, okay, we're in the hands of this idiot now because my guy lost. It's So the approval was very, very high at the beginning. Perhaps not so for Lee Myung-bak, but there's little distinctions in this, but generally, then it goes down, scandal, down, scandal, aid sent to jail, down. And by the last year, his or her own party's candidate doesn't want them campaigning with them because they're poison. So it's that bad. So Park Geun-hye her popularity is very low, and then this story came out on television about a tablet that showed she'd been sending. Anyway, the story was tablet belonged to her close friend. She's Park Geun-hye, single woman, unmarried. She's got no sort of intimate, no family. And she had a close friend who apparently she gave special access to the Blue House, and
who was another woman of similar age.
A woman of similar age, and who ran a couple of foundations that they got the chaebol to put some money into, and so on. And the way this was presented in the media was so bad that the country just flipped. I remember a taxi driver telling me she shouldn't be in the Blue House, she should be in a mental institute. In other words, people thought she was nuts. And then people started coming out in larger and larger numbers. And on the very first demo, the police very wisely, or the police actually cordoned off the area very, very tightly. By the second demo, they wisely lightened up, provided portable toilets and whatnot.
It was all very organised, wasn't it?
The atmosphere improved, and so there was an acknowledgement that people are allowed to demonstrate. There doesn't seem to be any hotheads trying to get into the Blue House or anything. So, and then it went from there. Okay, that is all good and fine in a democracy. Sometimes your leaders do things.
Yeah.
So there's two parts to this. One is that it turns out that the tablet, they still don't know who it belonged to. It didn't belong to the friend, didn't belong to Park, apparently, and it was inadmissible as evidence in the court.
The thing that
so
sparked
the main bit
whole,
of evidence was... So that's that. Anyway, don't worry, forget that. So then what happened was that the National Assembly, her own party basically split. And the National Assembly, therefore there was a majority to vote against her. They came up with all these reasons why she should be impeached. Goes to the Constitutional Court. They reject all of them except one. And that was enough. And it was that she gave too much power to her friend or something. I forget what. I think she asked her friend for a suggestion for a Minister of Culture or something. So,
God forbid you ask your friend for some help.
And then it goes to the trial. We all know what's going to happen.
Yeah,
she gets 33 years, and we all know she's not going to serve it. So, but to me, there was a failure along the way. There's a failure of media. To put this in context, like, how serious was this corruption in a relative sense? Maybe the rules are you can't give your friend a pass that lets her come into the Blue House. Maybe you're supposed to, even friends are supposed to have a thing. Okay, technical problem.
Yeah.
She asked a friend to suggest a minister, so not allowed to do that. And she got Samsung to give money to the friend's thing. Well, okay, is that the first time that's ever happened?
Definitely not.
No. And so now I asked friends in politics and media about this, several people, because the reason I got curious about it, because a lot of the politics of these days I kind of ignore, but I got very curious about this because I had a couple of European ambassadors ask me the question that you've asked your students. Why is this happening to her? Because I have to explain to my head office, in wherever it was, and my Korean staff give me a very one-sided view. Either if they support her, which I don't think anybody did, they would say it's all a communist plot, and if they're against her, they would say that she's something. So
it was all talk of shamanism and control. It was that mysticism was coming back, I think, wasn't it?
There was a bit of shamanism, though. To be fair to the Koreans on this, it was the foreigners who went with that.
Okay.
There was an anti-cult thing because her friend's father, in the Park Chung-hee days, had been some kind of religious. I don't know if he himself was some kind of prophet or whatever, but he had some influence in the Park administration. What it was, I don't know. And so their stories in Western media would be sort of cult connection or whatever it was, whereas I think the Koreans dropped that one pretty quickly. They weren't all that bothered by that.
Sounds more exciting, I think, for the Westerners to go with that story. And we get them these days as well, like anal probes and bum injections and shamans. They're still going with the current president. Sorry if you didn't know.
Oh yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I asked people. I'm
going to turn this heater off.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually really hot here.
Yeah.
I don't suppose our good friend. Can we? Does our good friend have any more? I've been going easy on this.
He does. Yeah.
Oh,
there's a little thing outside. We'll stop for a second and.
So can I just continue?
You please do. Yeah. I'll seamlessly edit it, or I'll just leave it as a.
So I asked people because these ambassadors, I realized I couldn't really answer the question for them. I said, I actually don't get it. Anyway, so I asked various political types. All responded in the same way. Different explanations, maybe.
Yeah.
But all of them referred immediately to to political reasons why she wasn't protected. In other words, they didn't say, well, you might not get this, but there's less tolerance for corruption, and it's clear that her friend, this is probably the tip of the iceberg, there's real corruption here, and I think the investigation will prove that or something. No, it was the best theory I got, the best explanation was that her Park Geun-hye had just prior to that appeared to favour Ban Ki-moon, and her party leaders thought she was going to go push him to be the next candidate because her relations with her own party weren't that great.
Was he the UN Secretary? He was the UN Secretary General at one point.
He was the UN Secretary General, would have been, by the time the election comes around, would have no longer been, because the election would have been in a year late, like 2018 or something. Yeah. And so that's why they were in no mood to... That's not why it happened, but that's why... The story could have just been, oh, here's a tablet, this is weird, and then disappeared the next day because nothing else comes out. Or it could even have been... I can't remember if there were stories going on at that time about these foundations. It could have continued, but it could have been one of those kind of fringe corruption stories that sort of...
You kind of expect in high-level Korean politics and room salons and all that stuff.
And so the explanation being there was nobody willing to, not a sufficient number of people willing to support her.
Wow.
And there were basically, not everyone I asked thought about Ban Ki-moon, but they all had that same explanation for why her party, she basically had this coming because she kind of cut herself off from the party and the leaders of the party and so on and so forth. And the irony, it might even be, I don't know.
So it was her own party, rather?
It was her, well, the explanation
the Conservative
being,
Party.
Had her party supported her, they wouldn't have had the votes in the assembly to impeach her.
Mm-hmm.
So the explanation for the politicians is not that, oh, she deserved it, she was corrupt. It's that political fact. So then the inquiry is, well, why did they not support her? Interestingly, I don't know if anyone's gone further and said, well, why did she cut herself off from them? Why was she so sort of isolated?
She was called sort of like this notebook princess, very isolated at the time. I remember
that's often seen, and to be honest with you, I've long seen that as sort of a negative thing, because I've even heard from people in their own parties, like, I don't even know how to get in touch with her, and this is when she wasn't, when she was the leader of the party, she was also a bit aloof, But I've recently wondered if there may even be a better explanation for that. That she was born into this type of position,
Yeah.
and she probably had no illusions about the civilian, the corruptness of the civilian politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And she had rapidly, because of who she was, had become the head of the party, and then wanted to distance herself because these guys are all seem to get involved in land deals and this and that, and the nod for the party leader or the president, once she becomes the president, the nod to approve certain things. I'm sure there'll be people asking for favors like this all the time. So she cut herself off from that. I don't know if that's true, but I don't know anyone who's actually looked into why that she might have been like that. If it's just personality, or if there was something else.
The psychology might suggest that she also saw both her parents assassinated.
Well, that's part of it. Yeah.
Imagine growing up like that, with becoming the first lady at the age of 19 or whatever it was she was, after her mother had been shot, and then her father shot, and so there might have also been that. Don't keep anybody too close to you.
Right.
There might have been. I'm not sure. It's
an interesting style because, I think Korea, the type of leader Korea needs is someone who's a bit of a son of a bitch, bit hard, and sort of rolls his sleeves, a kind of Lyndon Johnson type, who you probably think is probably a bit dirty at the edges, but because that, to function in this sort of society, you've got to be a bit of a hard man, a bit of a hard case.
Yeah.
And she wasn't, for whatever reason. I'm speculating about the reason, but anyway, I think all part of this. You use the word performative. I hesitate to use that, but anyway. But part of that is the pardon. See, this is another thing. It shows that justice is a bit of a joke because the courts can show the people that they're being tough by giving a sentence that's harsh, knowing that the person isn't going to serve out the time.
Right.
Or, depending on who the person is, if they're a chaebol head, they're really not going to serve much time at all. If they're a politician, they'll be out in a few years when it's politically okay. If they're the ordinary peasant, like the captain of the Seoul home, people like that, they might just get forgotten. God knows when they'll be allowed out. I mean, they got incredibly ridiculous sentences.
Yeah.
But
which kind of undermines the rule of law, doesn't it?
It does.
That it becomes symbolic rather than blind, let's say.
No, exactly. It undermines it because it shows it's sort of linked to political power. In other words, it's not operating independently. So the president will step in and pardon like twice a year, a bit like the King Charles giving his honours twice a year. The honours list, there'll be all these people getting pardoned twice a year.
Yeah.
And so that weakens the rule of law. It weakens the function of a pardon as well, because presumably there are times when a pardon is appropriate.
Yes.
But not when 5,000 people are being pardoned for stuff.
No. The Lee Jae-young, because Lee Jae-young also went to prison as part of all that with Choi Sun-sil. And just before I get to Lee Jae-young, there was what seems to have resonated since then is that I'm always told by South Korean people that Koreans care about discrimination, but they care about discrimination in terms of employment and education. They want fairness in society. The society's tough and it's competitive. They're not too worried about some Korean people. They're not too worried about the gender discrimination, the sex discrimination, but they want a fair crack of the whip when it comes to society in terms of getting a job and getting employment. And a lot of that, some of that Park Geun-hye story was about the young girl that passed through all her courses at Ewha without getting it. And we still see those stories coming up with ministers and their children and justice ministers and things, don't we?
Yeah.
That seems to be a resonant one at the moment, that society can be tough and hard and competitive as long as it's fair. And there seems to be a big push against this. Maybe Koreans will accept the chaebol as long as some of the chaebol are doing their part and not getting their kids through or the elite way.
Yeah, I mean, there's... you're right. There's a big streak of egalitarianism, and education is the great leveler.
Yeah.
You know, you have to perform in order to get anywhere, and so the rich are able to sort of do things that the poor aren't able to. But basically, the system is such that the the son or daughter of the poor man can become the president.
Yeah.
You know, so which is something really good about this society.
It's like a No Muhyun figure or something like that. Is
Yeah,
is that
people-
correct
yeah,
characterization, I think?
Yeah. Well, almost all of them. I mean, they say Kim Jong-sam came from a middle-class family, but I think middle class back in the 1940s was, you know, what we would call poor. So, yeah, you know, so I was going to say something about justice again. I forgot what it was now.
I liked that. I'll speak a little bit, see if you can think of it. When Lee Jae-young, the de facto head of Samsung at the time, he was taken in ropes and given a long sentence. And then when the COVID-19 pandemic came out, South Korea was looking around the world and going, "We've got no vaccines. Like everyone else has got these Pfizer ones and things like that." And then there was this. I'm not sure if I'm describing it right, but as I understood the situation, there was like, shall we let Lee Jae-young out of jail to go to America, speak to Pfizer, and get us some vaccines? And the people were like, yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. It was like doing a duty for the nation.
Well, this is the thing that's, and this is where I think earlier on in my time in Korea, I might be more judgmental. And forgive me if I sound like I'm, you know, the way I'm criticizing the Korean justice system, I wouldn't want you to read into it that, oh, we should be more like America or Britain or something like that. Because I think, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, what is justice and what kind of system of justice does a society want? And so one of the things you see here a lot, or you just referred to it, is the idea, oh, this person is contributing to the national economy, therefore I, the judge, will give them a lighter sentence or let them out, you know. And there's a kind of a collective sense in which this is acceptable to us. And there is a part of justice that is, it's targeted at society. Society needs to be comfortable with itself. But in our Christian sphere, there's an idea that justice is separate from us, and there's something sort of spiritual about it, that it's a sort of it's more linked to an absolute good. Oh, you have committed this crime, therefore you must pay this penalty. And whether you're rich or poor or who's lobbying for you, I mean, it does get factored in, but in principle, it doesn't matter, you know. And I mean, I say I prefer that system because that's the one I instinctively think is real justice.
Because that's how you grew up and what you're used to. Yeah.
But I can see, you know, if the whole of society is saying, yeah, let Lee Jae-myung out, but keep those others in, okay, there's a certain, you know, because another function of justice is sort of wagging your finger at the rest of society. You know, this is what happens if you do, you know. Yeah.
And to a certain extent, society...
I just realised I'm appalling half of your readers, your listeners.
I think it should be clear for those that don't know, and I did it in the notes that I sent you, that maybe we'll come on to it later, that you have no desire to change the country or to demand that Korea be like this, that you're and I was speaking to this about this with a mutual friend of ours, Jacko, that there's not this idea to be prescriptive. This is what Korea should do, and it wants to be like this, because that's a very easy trap to fall into. I think I fell into that in my early days because everything was so different. And as a young 20-year-old hothead, I was like, no, like this. You need bins on the street like we have in England, and you need this stuff. And then after a while, you slowly realize to not try to be so prescriptive and to let Korean people find the answers for Korean people. I always get that sense from your work. So I want to make that clear. Let me turn you to this, if I can, Mike, which is that in a lot of books I read about Korea, they will often do the economy, or the history or the politics, but very few of them talk about culture. Very few of them talk about behavior and actions and relationships. And one of the most amazing things about your two books, The Koreans and The New Koreans, is that, from my perspective, and you can say whether I'm reading, is that you address how Koreans behave and do things. And this is not in great sort of generalizations or trying to paint all 50 million as the same, but you do talk about the day-to-day life rather than these sort of grand impersonal, and then the economy was here and the economy was here. You talk about that. There was one, it was in The New Koreans, maybe something like chapter 18, about these people in a church building for morning service or something like that, and they're all meant to be there praying, but they're asleep, and somebody would walk past them and kick them and say, "Wake up, you're meant to be praying." But then there came a point when these young people would stand up and say, "You're not allowed to kick me anymore. We won't take these." And you seem to address culture in a way in your writing. Are you doing that? Am I reading it? Am I reading it correctly or incorrectly? Or
yeah, well, yes, and I think it's kind of what I'm interested in, but it's also, I'm not very academic. I'm a journalist, and I'm not even a journalist now, but and I think I have I think one weakness I have as a journalist is sort of the short attention span. I haven't studied. Another problem I have, you get people like this. I remember being with a company I worked for, being on a weekend training where we went through all these questionnaires and to figure how do you learn. And it turned out there were 4 ways that people learn. I forget what they are now, but one of them is like through experience. One is through reading and stuff like that. And I was in that group of people who learn by doing something. So I've tried to get, when I've had a new job or new profession, I've tried to get a book out about it, teach self-journal, and I honestly can't get past the first page. I just cannot do it. So I tend to read about things after the event. So I'm not very systematic. I don't have theories and stuff like that. So I kind of discover Korea through people, if you like. So the sort of the bigger picture theorizing is just for some glue to put it together with. So it's really just the perspective I've had, and I found things. I suppose the reason I made the effort was the politicians. I was dealing as a journalist with, I think, the worst part of Korea in the early days, which was business and politics.
Right.
But with other Koreans, I found I had enormous affection for them and great. I'll tell you a small insight. I can't remember if I wrote about this, but this is shortly after I was here. And you being British, you'll get this perfectly. I was walking up by the Lotte department store downtown.
Yeah.
Which used to be 2 departments. It used to be Lotte and Midapa, 2. And all the way down that road, I think even now, it's all the bus routes through Seoul. The bus routes, being private companies, wanted to come this way. This is where all the traffic was.
Yeah.
So there was the whole, like for 100 meters, it was kind of bus stops. And one sort of evening, it must have been in the summer because it was still light. I think people leaving from work or something. I was walking up that road with everybody sort of waiting for buses, and the buses would be coming from behind me. So they're all looking at me. I'm a foreigner. They're all looking at me.
Yeah.
And the British person in me was exquisitely embarrassed. And I thought about this, and people were like sort of just staring at me like that, and I felt like sort of going, what are you looking at? Or I didn't sort of cave into embarrassment. I just sort of mentally phased it out or something. But it made me really think, and I realized I come from a country. You know what I'm going to say. I come from a country where people, especially young people, they're always going, "Hey mate, look at him. Look at that bloke there. commenting negatively about people, picking up on, oh, look at big ears there, or, and race and so, look at the black guy, look at him, what do you think, this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas I realized that they weren't doing that. They were simply open-mindedly observing, and if I smiled at them, they would smile back. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of simply, here's a stranger. And something inside me shed that English self-conscious critic.
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, I can be very comfortable living here in that sort. So this is all a sort of an invisible thing I went through, and so that made me want to understand people. And the other thing was I also admired the pace of change, and people were it was also a dictatorship, and people in a dictatorship are disciplined in a way that they're not in a free country, that they seem to be more focused and, I want to do this when I grow up, I want to do this, and I found that very impressive. That sort of, it was that Korean energy, which is still going. It's that sort of driving the country on. And there's no celebration here of, none of the social heroes here are sort of telling their story about how they finally kicked heroin after 20 years and all that sort of. But our heroes are all sort of, a lot of them, our cultural heroes, are kind of anti-heroes, aren't they? You get like the Rolling Stones are still going. These are like the bad boys that we've grown up with for the last 60 years, So we don't
glorify their drug use or something like that.
And their sort of antisocial behaviour and stuff like that. There's a real sort of earnestness here that coming from that other kind of culture, you can sort of think, wow, this is so different, but it's kind of nice. So that's not a good answer to your question, but it's how my disposition is sort of rather like that.
And it must be doing something if you've been here for 40 plus years that you have shed. I sometimes use this term Koreanization. I use it to my young students that come over here because we always talk about westernization, modernization, globalization. So I like to give them the term Koreanization, which is, if you've been here for 1 year, there will be a little part of you perhaps that has become a little bit Korean or influenced by Korean. It might be the way you get your haircut. It might be something you wear. It might be what you watch. But a little bit of Korean will come into you, and after 40 years, it's inevitable that, something will have influenced you in Korea. Sorry.
Well, things influence you, but I think these are often internal and invisible things rather than necessarily stylistic things. I remember thinking, years ago, it was about 1987, I think, 88, I went down to Jeju Island because I was researching the uprising that had happened there 40 years earlier. And I made an appointment to meet Father Patrick McGlinchey, who was an Irish missionary who had transformed the island. He's a man who introduced sheep.
I've read about him so many times.
Okay.
I've read it. You met his, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I ring him up and say, he said, I said, I'll come to you, and he said, where are you staying? I said, well, I'm at this hotel. He said, I'll meet you at the hotel. And actually what he wanted to do, he was thinking of starting up a hotel training thing. So he actually asked me to come up to the room, and he measured the room. He wanted to. Anyway, he's kind of anyway. But when I was waited in the lobby in the coffee shop, and I'm sort of expecting. I've been there in Korea for 5 years. This guy's been here since the war. 53, I think he came.
How old was he? What kind of age roughly when you met him?
So he, let's see, he had been there 35 years. So he must have been 60s, 70s, 60s maybe.
And on Jeju basically, was it?
The whole time.
Yeah.
Wow. So he, I'm expecting, I thought, okay, maybe he's going to be wearing a hanbok or something, and he'll come in and he'll sort of go like this. So here comes this big guy with the dog collar on, flicking dandruff off his black sort of Catholic. He said, "It's Michael, is it? Is it yourself?" just straight out of Donegal or somewhere.
Yeah.
And sorry, that was a bad accent, but so in that sense, I think people do remain who they are to a great extent. But you start to get used to certain things. You and I probably get used to being looked at twice, maybe not downtown, but where we go. And then you go home and you find nobody's looking at you like that, and it sort of throws you a little bit, Am I nothing?
Why aren't you looking at me? Yeah. Even negatively.
yeah, that would do. So, but certain other things definitely rub off.
Can I give you the one of small talk, which is when I was back in, and I did write about this, but when I was back in the UK in November, just standing in line at a coffee shop, and someone would say up to me, "Oh, it's a bit cold today, isn't it, love?" Or you'd be waiting for a bus and someone would go, "Bloody hell, mate." And they would just say something to you. Yeah. You've never met them before, but there was this idea that you could speak to strangers and just a throwaway line or a casual greeting, something, a joke. Yeah. It doesn't happen as much here. It's a bit more silent here, isn't it? Yeah. You don't sort of vocalize to other people, which is not to say it's better or worse, but sometimes that silence can be here rather deafening.
That's right, because you can, we're in a city that there's so many people living so close together. You can walk out amid hundreds. Obviously, one part of your brain is aware because you're not sort of knocking people over, but you're thinking of something else. Whereas, in England, it's sort of you're in a line and you're suddenly aware of everybody else, and so they turn around and start talking. The other thing is, one thing I have become accustomed to is silence in, conversations that just run dry for a minute or two, like when you're eating lunch with someone, you don't say anything for a while. Whereas for, I think, most, certainly English-speaking people, maybe most Westerners, after about 5 seconds, sort of you start squirming and feel the need to say something, however inane it may be.
More comfortable silence is here.
So silence is not a threat in that sense.
There's this is a bit disrespectful. Are you aware of chavs?
Chavs,
yeah. Like standing outside the co-op, like smoking cigarettes, buys 20 Bensons, mate, that kind of thing. I don't see many chavs here. No. That so you mentioned this idea of people. There's not these heroes with the drug problems or things like this, and of course nobody's perfect, and we're painting these kind of pictures just to be descriptive, though. But I also don't see sort of youth delinquency on the streets or that kind of thing. The convenience stores will have nobody in them and things like this. I do like that about this place. I don't know how they do it, though. I don't know whether it's because we started this part talking about culture, whether is that culture, is that just resources? Am I just romanticizing one view of Korea here and seeing it differently? Do you see what I mean by that? Whether there's something in the culture or
I don't know what it is, because Koreans have been through so much in the last 100 years. There was a time when there were loads of people just sort of sitting there balefully looking at you, and maybe if you're a woman being a bit threatening and stuff like that. So what's transformed it, I don't know. But ironically, an unfair justice system, sorry, I'm not arguing for an unfair justice system, might help a bit, because you're going to get knocked about if you're a bad boy. If you're whereas the justice system back home may bend over backwards to try and be understanding of people who resort to stealing stuff out of the convenience store. Whereas in fact what they need is a slap over the head type of thing. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the reason is, but I can't imagine. There's a lot of pilfering in Britain, for example, particularly with young people sort of stealing small stuff.
I haven't heard the word pilfer for so long.
Oh, is that an old one?
Yeah.
And
Pilfer.
I can't imagine. I'm sure it happens here.
Yes, of course.
But I can't imagine somebody in this country risking their reputation, their family relations, and everything else, just for a 10,000 won to not pay for a book or something.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
Whereas, so there's I don't know what the explanation is, but it's something that you would think that societies that struggle with delinquency and that sort of thing, you'd think they would study. Societies like Korea and Japan, Singapore and places like that, to see, well, why don't they have this problem? Taiwan.
Yeah.
You know.
Maybe, and I don't think it's to do with, because I've often wondered whether it's time, and if you run Korea forward another 100 years or something and the democracy becomes a bit more enmeshed, then people will get a little bit, freer is the wrong word, but behavior might change. It's because it's a new democracy and that plays a role, but there might be something more to it. I was speaking to I don't know if I get in trouble for telling this story, but I was speaking to my wife this morning, and she's gone back to work after 7 years of raising children, and she now takes the subway into Gangnam to her office. And I was speaking to her about it this morning, and she said it's much safer now. She said because all the men are very sort of careful now with their hands, and because they all have their smartphones, and
they've got something to do.
They've got something to do, but she said it's, I was trying to understand how it felt different for her, but she was like, she was born in 1977, so the subway used to be a place of a little bit more fear of closeness and touching, and there was that, and now it's become a lot more sort of personal space and boundaries, whether COVID has played any role in that.
You've reminded me we should acknowledge that when we say that Korea is very safe, it's, I think, what you and I would be thinking is very safe for men, because we come from a country where there's almost like there's a tribal mentality between young men, and it's you have to be very careful in certain situations not to get physically assaulted, just because you're there or you come from another school or something. Whereas, and to sort of say, okay, this doesn't happen in Korea, but actually women do have a different experience, and I think the distinction is these sort of young thugs, let's call it, the Daily Mail calls them. It's a point of honor to take on another man and to maybe defend a woman. They wouldn't sort of go around thumping, and they might thump their girlfriends and things. But I mean,
yes,
doing that to a woman is really bad form. Yeah. Whereas in Korea, people tend not to go try and assault somebody when they run the risk of being beaten themselves. In other words, they'll go for weaker people. And so women don't only get sort of touched up and stuff like that, but they can actually get insulted and insulted. I think every non-Korean who's got a Korean partner has probably experienced that. Some sort of guys mouthing off at the woman, "What are you doing with that foreigner?"
Gender relations are a little bit different here. The idea, I think they're changing, but I've heard people tell me how sort of men and women boys and girls are separated at 7 and things like this, and there is this kind of, you're different and you must be treated differently, whereas maybe at least for me growing up, it was just, yes, of course, girls are a big mystery or something, but in the end, boys and girls will be friends and sit down together and go to parties together. I think those gender relations are slowly changing here. We've spoken a lot about culture, and I like culture, just because I want to, if I can, before we talk about writing, touch on leadership. And let me start with this one, because I was just speaking to Jacko, and I know you will have told this story before to some people, but you've got. I'm jumping straight in with this one, Mike. But you got to meet Kim Il Sung, right? Like in person. Is that correct?
Haven't washed my hands since.
I mean, I don't think I know anybody else that has, or have spoken to anyone else that has. So it might be a boring story for you.
No,
but,
not at all.
But like, how does that go about? Because what was I imagine him just to give me this, but I've always tried to. He seemed like a very tall, charismatic, powerful man. Perhaps in his when he was at his peak, but you met him late. But give us Kim Il Sung in person.
Well, I mean, he was quite old. This was shortly before he died. It was April 16th.
What was the weather like?
A balmy day, a balmy spring day, 1994. And so he died in July then.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, I was in a group. There were three media outlets: Washington Times, NHK, Japan, and CNN. And we had attached ourselves to a group of dignitaries from other countries. Dignitaries, about 4 of them, I think.
The ambassadors, or
I'm trying to remember who they were. They were like. No, it was an organization of former prime ministers and things like that.
Okay.
And the only one I can remember, there was a former Governor General of Canada.
Okay.
His name, honestly, I'd have to check my notes to remember who they were now. And then there was some. It was sort of a body that was going to come to, April the 15th is North Korea's big.
Day
Kim
of
Il
the
Sung's,
Sun.
Yeah, Kim Il Sung's birthday. It's like Christmas Day.
It's the day the Titanic sank, isn't it? Is it the same?
April 12th.
12th.
Hold on, just a minute.
It's April 12th, isn't it?
Why do they celebrate his birthday on April the 15th? Anyway,
maybe they're on a Juche calendar by then.
Yeah. Could be. Yeah. Anyway, there was this group, and then there was some from Washington. There's some academics, and then there was like 7 of us journalists. So altogether, about 20 people.
Okay.
And that was a year when most of North Korea's allies, communism had collapsed. Most of the allies were not sending senior delegations to this annual event, Kim Il Sung's thing. So we were actually either the most senior or relatively high-level group. And so we got lunch with him.
It's in Pyongyang.
In Pyongyang.
Yeah, okay.
We got lunch with him on the next day, you see, on the 16th. And there was a hour and a half session with him that was like an interview. But it wasn't an interview by the journalist. The journalists, we were sort of tagging along. We weren't sort of being journalists really. So there was these, Kim Il Sung, the North Koreans are over here, and then the dignitaries were here.
Yeah. And
I was sitting in a seat behind. Although at one point I got up and walked around to the side to try and get a photo of, Kim Il Sung had this big goiter, and the bodyguard just sort of moved in front of the camera.
What is a goiter?
A goiter is like a growth on the neck. It was about a fist-sized growth on the neck. And
I knew he had it. I just don't know what a goiter is, or it wasn't a tumor, was it? There's a difference.
It wasn't. It's benign, apparently.
Okay.
It's just a growth,
Yeah.
Anyway, and then we move in for. Did I say one thing was an hour and a half? The other thing was 2 hours, and I forget which is which now. But then we move in for the meal, which is big round table. And that's when some of the journalists, not me, because I was with my managing editor, so I'm too junior to say anything.
Yeah.
But people would sort of ask him questions, and he was very kind of gracious, and nobody tried the human rights record. No, you just don't bother. Yeah. It's pointless.
Yeah.
You're just playing for your own audience if you do stuff like that. The best responses with dictators are things like, in fact, somebody did ask. Here's a good example. If you ever meet a dictator, to ask them the soft question. someone said, "Sir, you've been a leader for a long time. What do you do for relaxation?" And this got him going, and he told this story of how he said, "Well, when I was younger, I used to like fishing and hunting. We even hunt bears and things like that in North Korea." And he said, "Even now, I sometimes, go to. There's an area on the East Coast where we go and hunt bear, but I know actually that the soldiers raise these tame bears, and then they stand behind a tree, and when they see me, they push the bear out." And it was. It was a kind of dictator.
It's like a spoof comedy movie or something,
like
isn't
dictator, apart from me sort of never having shot anything in my life, I sort of thought, but
poor baby, it's odd.
But fun, laughing at himself,
That's nice.
So the other thing that struck me was that his responses to things showed that he was living in the past, everything seemed to be framed in terms of the Japanese occupation or the Korean War. But he was very gracious. He would say, with all due respect to our Japanese guests from NHK, and as you know, we fought a war against America, but CNN was desperate to try and get him to agree to do an interview. And they tried several ways. It actually got a bit embarrassing, but he finally said, "I have no wish to thrust myself upon the world." That's how it was translated into English. And so then on the way out, at the beginning, we all queued up to shake his hands, and I decided to jump out of the queue, and I went up near beside him to take pictures and listen to the little interaction between people. But on the way out, we shook hands, and I shook hands with him, and I told him in Korean that I was the Seoul correspondent. I thought he might sort of go, "Oh, that's interesting," or something. But it's like he wasn't there,
Okay.
like, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we got told after that he was already sick, and he'd actually got out of bed to come for the meeting with us, and then back to bed again. So he wasn't all there. It felt like, or he just sort of thought, well, who do you think you are, you little,
Yeah. Do you get a sense when you're around? I mean, because there you are shaking hands with a man that would run a country of 25 million people, that would be personified. And I saw that wonderful photo of you and Kim Dae-jung and Paul Shin where he's talking to you over a wall. And I had to stop for a second. It's like, which one's Mike? Oh, that one's Mike, because you look very different.
I had hair, right?
That's what caught me at first. And I couldn't see your face. It was to the side. But before I ask you about Kim Dae-jung, do you get a sense when you're standing in front of people like that will be pivotal figures in a nation that will lead, that whose names get written down? Or is it just, no, this is a person, and they're just like, they'll tell a joke, or they're not all there? Is there a special sense when you're in the presence of someone like that, or is that not there? Is that a weird question?
No, but I see it's, I mean, you have to bear in mind that the reporter is it's work.
Right.
And the thing is, when you report, I mean, I've had the experience of people coming to Korea, like famous people, say, I can't think of an example, but, they're having a press event, some say, "Oh, Mike, are you going?" Say, "Oh, I can't be bothered." It's like, you're not interested because it's work.
Right.
And if you don't have to cover it, then what's the point? It's not,
Mm-hmm.
If it was sort of Mick Jagger, or, I used to like mountaineering, so if any famous mountaineer came along, I would have jumped to see them. But politician stuff, I'm not, so,
No.
But the thing is, at the time, you just see them for what they are. Here's the leader of an opposition in a country. Nobody really thought 1 year from now there will be democracy.
Mm-hmm.
No one's really. I mean, I had a sort of a gut feeling that things were just getting better all the time. but nobody, and even when I expressed that, people thought I was mad. So, sorry, what do you mean there'll be democracy eventually? So, didn't you see what's on the streets now? This is I have the same thing now with when I tell people I think China will become a democracy. Nobody believes me, but that's based on my experience in Korea. I don't see where else they're going. It'll be their own version of it, but Kim Dae-jung, he was charismatic often that feeling is created by the people around them. In other words, when you meet a Kim Dae-jung, you're not bumping into him in the convenience store.
It's not one-on-one.
Yeah, DJ, how's it going, mate? No. There's always sort of people around, But he was Kim Dae-jung. Actually, I knew him very well, and our small group of half a dozen journalists, the correspondents, would have lunch with Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam about once every month or 6 weeks or so.
Wow.
One time we'd pay, one time they'd pay. We sort of, it was quite, was it 6 weeks? I can't remember. Anyway, it was very often. And I'd often ring up his house and talk to him directly and stuff like that. And so I got to know him better, and people liked him better. One reason was simply that he spoke English, which helps. The other was that he was driven by something, and had a sort of feeling of destiny about him, and had suffered. I remember once sitting next to him in his house. There were about 6, 7 of us around the table, sitting next to him, listening to him talk, and getting a bit choked up because I just sort of felt why are you taking all this on? There were riot. We had to come through the riot police. The riot police blocked. Only foreign diplomats and foreign journalists were allowed through. So why do you take all this on? Kim Young-sam was a bit of a different personality. He was not as thoughtful, not as intellectual, and Kim Dae-jung is the sort of person, if you say, Mr. Kim, why do you want to be the president? He would sort of go 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Kim Young-sam couldn't really answer a question like that. It's like, well, I don't know. Why are you interviewing me? It's sort of
it's Monday. Yeah. What kind of suffering are you pointing to with DJ or Kim Dae-jung? Because I remember seeing pictures of him with a cane or walking. I'm not sure if that was with the suffering. Is that psychological? Is that physical? Or what are you pointing to with that?
He was the difficulty in walking came from an accident that they believe was a truck hit the car he was in. They believe it was targeted. This is in the Park Chung-hee era. So he was targeted then, and then under Chun Doo-hwan is actually sentenced to death, and then reprieved. He was never brutalized in prison. He was too famous for that. But he nevertheless sort of took on this sort of role to fight for democracy. And that never seemed like it was going to come.
No.
So that's what I mean. That suffering in that sense.
There's a beautiful picture of his inauguration, where he's standing there with his hand over his heart with his wife, the first lady next to him, and in the background you can see Kim Young-sam, No Tae-woo, and Chun Doo-hwan, and he wanted them all to be there, despite them or Chun Doo-hwan, No Tae-woo, having given him a death sentence at one point, and done that, and he thought, when I see that picture, I just think, wow, what a move that is by him.
Well, this came from his. I think some people are a little bit cynical, think he was just political, but he was a Catholic, and his wife was very religious, and I think it came from a sort of a Christian forgiveness, but also a realization that for this country to function, we have to break the cycle of revenge, and frankly, we haven't managed that yet. If you look the way each administration persecutes the previous one, So he recognized the need for that, which is why he would insist that whatever he personally thought of Chunduwan, he was the formal president of the country. Therefore he should be here in the inauguration. This sort of idea of I'll pick who I want in my inauguration. We're actually in the world. If you look at all this kind of the wokeness of the world, we're moving certainly in Western intellectual circles into a very, very judgmental type of environment. When this president, he said the N word in an email about 10 years ago, so he's not coming to my inauguration. This guy sentenced me to death, but he will be there because I want to show respect for the institution,
And to build forward and to do something better, and like you say, to break that cycle, because it feels like Korea is not learning that important lesson that Kim Dae-jung was trying to teach at that point, and that to me is. I've also heard people that say that was the height of liberal media during Kim Dae-jung's time, when that was, and since then this was Lee Tae-eung, the director from KBS. He said it was about that period where you could fly back and forth, and since then he believes it's sort of they've pushed it either side. I don't know if this might be telling tales out of school, or I have no idea how you're going to respond to this question, so please forgive me if it's not a nice one. Donald Kirk, the journalist, he wrote a book called Korea Betrayed, which sort of put Kim Dae-jung in a bad light. For what he did with the Sunshine Policy, for engaging with North Korea. Do you have a take on that?
Well, I think what Don Kirk did in his book is he established that the summit meeting with Kim Jong-il, North Korea, in 2000, for which Kim Dae-jung got the Nobel Prize, or at least was the main reason he got the Nobel Peace Prize that year, was bought, and for a lot of money.
500 million, I believe.
500 million. And the money was provided by Hyundai. Hyundai also provided other money for other things. It was leading the charge on North Korea. And then the chairman of Hyundai committed suicide at some point, presumably when it looked like the investigation was getting close to him or something. So none of this, let's face it, Kim Dae-jung was an opposition politician from the 60s. He rose to prominence in the early 70s as a compromise. The opposition party decided they needed youngsters to run against Park Chung-hee. And between Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, and another leader called Lee Chol-sung, Kim Dae-jung won. And so from then, he, as the opponent of Park Chung-hee, he was thrust to the forefront of things in a dictatorship. So 20 years in dictatorship, how are you going to raise money? You're going to do some funny money stuff. And, I asked somebody once, this is in the early 90s, when Kim Dae-jung just lost his fourth presidential elections before he was president. Why is he still the leader of the party? In say America, if you lose an election, that's you're forgotten. That's it. And the person told me, I forget the figures now, I think it was 300 million. He said, our party needs about 300 million won a month to operate. He's the only person who, with one phone call, can get that money.
Wow.
And they described things of sacks of money being dragged along this is before the 50,000 won note. So and so, the idea that you've got to pay off North Korea to do something like that hasn't gone away. If we want progress with North Korea, we might have to do that. It's only what he didn't realize, though. I think he was deluding himself a bit when he thought this was a price to pay for improved ties, and that ties would improve and that things would get better. And I think it's complete misreading of North Korea, what he suffered from. And I think the Roh Moo-hyun had the same problem, and I think Moon Jae-in had the same problem. They actually are not, they're fantasizing about what they're dealing with and not really, I actually think the what we call the conservatives, like Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, Yoon now, the current president, the breakthrough with North Korea is probably more likely to come with people like that than it is with the other side until they drop their fantasy. So I think Don Kirk's book sort of put all that it went into that in some detail and it exposed it all. And I think that's a good thing. And if I remember rightly, it's Kim Dae-jung actually broke South Korean law in the process. I mean, in other words, while it was understandable that you pay off North Korea, it should have probably been done in a more, according to our own standards.
Yeah.
We have to live by our own values and standards. And I think he broke that.
It's not for me to judge, but when you said about this fantasy of North Korea, you can perhaps maybe forgive Kim Dae-jung because it hadn't really been tried, and so I think with ex-President Moon Jae-in maybe it's a little bit different because we've been down this road, we know where it goes, but can I pick up two threads because I want to make sure I get to this writing aspect before we run out of time. I want to pick up two threads. One is you mentioned Kim Dae-jung, Kim Yong-sam, and then Lee Chol-sung.
Lee Chol-sung.
I'm going to be. I don't.
No, he's not well known, but he was quite a fascinating character. He was a real right winger. I mean, he was. I think he was a Korea University student leader in the 1940s, and they and a rightist who engaged in probably physically punch-ups and things with left. There's a lot of left-right violence then. So he was on the political spectrum. You would get Kim Dae-jung, who was sort of centre-left, Kim Yong-sam centre-right, and then Lee Chol-sung right, further right. I think in the Korean spectrum. I don't think we should think in British or American terms when we think of that. It's
left
a different
and right
thing.
Yeah,
it's
very different.
That's a huge mistake. I see going off on this theme, I see so much commentary by non-Koreans picking up these words, right, left, conservative, liberal, far right, far left, and assuming they know what that means in the Korean context. And it's very, very different. And the frustrating thing about it is it's like, okay, this President Yoon, he's a conservative, rightist or whatever, therefore I disapprove of him. They don't know what they're talking about.
No.
So it's very, very
I agree with you.
frustrating, but it's very common now, that labeling. But anyway, Lee Chol-sung, get back to him.
It's just very quickly. It's not seeing Korea through Korean eyes. It's they're bringing their own understanding of those words, their own baggage with them, and failing to see it in the context, aren't they? I think is the problem. Yeah, sorry. Lee Chol-sung, this Korean rightist that likes throwing fists.
Yeah. No, I knew him actually.
Was he a big guy? What did he look like?
He was a big guy. He spoke English, and he had an office in JoongAng. I remember going there some years ago. I forget when he died now, but he would have been, born in like 1925, 1930, around that time. So he must have died like 20 years ago or something. I remember going to his office and say, Mr. Breen, how are you? And he calls somebody, coffee, but he's doing it to like an 80-year-old man, It was that sort of way of behaviour. He was quite a character, but his political career sort of didn't sort of go. But he was one of the young bloods at that time.
Yeah. That's a new name for me. Last one, on this one, you mentioned Hyundai chairman committing suicide when things were coming. I didn't put any of this in the notes, but sometimes I've tried to impress on my students that we said the words left and right don't mean the same in Korea as they do. Can the same be said about suicide here? Because growing up, you use this word like in this Christian nation or wherever people might grow up, suicide is, you're not meant to do that. You go to limbo or purgatory or whatever the beliefs might be. It's God that chooses life and death and things like that. But over here, it seems to be, I'm not sure, but people use it as a way of demonstrating innocence or demonstrating goodness, that if you see it through Korean eyes, not for every case, but there is a different resonance here with suicide.
It has a very different meaning. I mean, there isn't the Christian, historically, the Christian prohibition against it that you described. This is, in the Christian world, historically, this is a pretty sinful thing to do, And I think suicides didn't get buried where other people. There was all sorts of manifestations of that in social behaviour and stuff. But in this part of the world, suicide is often seen as like the ultimate protest. It's the when you have no other recourse. This is something you can do. There was something, you just reminded me, I forget the details of this, but Jacko and other people, have you talked to Brian Myers?
Only by email. He's a wonderful guy. He helps me with every question I might ask, because he's got a very abrasive personality in blogs and writing. But whenever I send an email and ask a question, he's
very good.
Courteous, generous.
So, or Andrei Lankoff, they'll know this better than me, but there's some... I think in North Korea, there's some... I mean, you would think there wouldn't be a punishment for suicide, but I think the families of suicides then... So, I know when I found this out. I was ghostwriting a defector's book, and her father committed suicide. He took pills in the hospital, was taken to hospital, and his wife... bribed the doctor to write on the death certificate that heart failure or something. That was it. And the reason being that suicide is such a devastating form of protest. And so in North Korea, that's how they... You imagine... North Koreans committing suicide, like the monks in Vietnam or that sort of thing against Kim Il-sung. This would be hugely emotive and rile people up. So it's not the people don't see that as sinful in that sense. It's more like this person has been driven to this, and then they're almost like innocent victims of what it was they were protesting against, and now we are required to take action, so it's a different thing.
It's fascinating that in North Korea, it would be seen as protesting, like the state is not worth living in, or the glorious leader has not built something good enough for me to want to inhabit. Yeah, because it is different here. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there is something about... It's seen as a protest. It's seen as innocence. We've seen very high-profile figures, and it does seem to go differently.
There was a lot of student suicide. There was a whole spate of student suicides around, I think, the early 90s, even after democracy. So they weren't related to democratization. It was more other protesting about North Korea and so on. And then failed suicide. People. It's pretty tragic. Actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a very dark subject. I didn't mean to go there, but it's something that comes up a lot in the international press. Those figures and things will come out, and it's just about trying to understand it.
Yeah,
to save lives sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes there's another form of... Now, sorry, went off because we've been talking about politics and the sort of suicide as protest, but the other part of it, Korea has... the fourth highest suicide rate in the world, I believe. And a lot of that, apparently, is elderly people, when they fall sick, don't want to be a burden. So they just don't take their medicine, or they, whatever, that. So there may even be more deaths that aren't classified, aren't categorized as suicide, but it's things like that. A lot of it is economic related, and so it gives you a sense. This is something we haven't really talked about, but the level of distress in this society is, this is not a happy society, despite how much affection you and I have for it, and how much we admire, and how much Korea is admired in the world. It's not at one with itself in that collective sense. Lowest birth rate in the world, fourth highest suicide rate, tells you something.
Are these? I agree with you. Is it possible that it's teething problems is the wrong word, and I don't mean to be insensitive, but with the compressed modernity, with this rapid urbanization of bringing people, especially if we're talking people that are elderly, born in the 40s, 50s, if they look around this city, they might think this is not the Korea that I know, or it's very different from what I'm used to. Is it an effect, and once things level out, then we might see more stability, or do you think that there is, or another question would be to frame it like this: is any country really at peace with itself, or at one with itself in that sense?
Yeah, true. That's a good point. I don't know what the answer is, but there's a highly competitive edge to Korea.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of pressure. Family relations aren't always great. A lot of pressure in families. And there aren't many. If you don't do well at education, for example, there's not your options get lowered. But there's also not until recently been a great awareness of the need for counselling and that sort of internal mental health issues. There's this program on now. I don't know if you watch it. What is it? I forgot the name of it. With Paksa.
It's called something like Gumseki. Gumneseki.
Kumchakatseki or something. Anyway,
something like that. Our golden children. Yeah.
And this is riveting people. Yeah. And this lady has become a rock star.
Yeah.
And it's pointing to the need for different approach to relations, particularly parenting and things like that. So this is all hopeful, I think.
I'll tell you a story about that program in particular. They've been on my case for about a month, wanting me to take my children on the show. Multiple phone calls.
Really?
And my wife is really wants to meet the rock star child psychologist, but a little bit hesitant because I'm like, my children don't have problems. Like, I have problems. If you want to deal with my addictions and alcoholism and things like this, I will take the treatment. But these programs, they do have to construct narratives, and our kids, they're not angels, but they're pretty happy and healthy.
Sorry, can we pick this up?
Yeah,
I need to rush to the...
Yeah, absolutely, okay. Please. Yeah.
All right.
No, don't apologise. I've kept you here far too long. We are nearly finished, I promise.
That's kind of... that's fascinating. So they want you... someone hasn't come up and said, hey, you want a foreigner with kids who are really... but it's more that they just... Because they sometimes have celebrities on there who just open up. So it's more in that vein, right?
I'm not sure, but they've made 3 phone calls thus far, and they've asked to speak to my wife as well, and I must say they're very nice when I speak to them, but I'm just a little bit hesitant about using my children on television. If it were me and things like that, I'm I pick and choose my battles wisely. But for my children, I'm a little bit more hesitant. I would like them to be able to make their own decisions and not to grow up and see, because it is about constructing narratives sometimes, right? And so, but that's a big thing these days. It is, isn't it? Yeah, there you go. I want to bring this towards the final stretch. This next section of questions that I want to speak to you about is just purely selfish. Which is this is nothing to do with Korean studies, Mike. But why are you such a good writer?
Oh, yeah.
This is the blunt version of the question, but your books I use on my syllabus for contemporary Korean studies. I find them immensely readable. You said earlier yourself that you're not an academic, and I think that's in your favor. There's none of this. Sometimes you read stuff and I don't understand what they're saying. I'm an intelligent guy, but they use all these words and things that I don't get. But your writing is there. Now, you've been doing it an incredibly long time, I guess. How do you write? Are there any particular approaches that you take? Was there something you were told as a young man and it stuck with you? Can you tell me about the art, the craft, please?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I had dinner a few years ago with Colin Marshall, who you had on here, and another expat, and we were sort of talking about stuff. And my book was just coming out, New Koreans, and I said to them that I finally think I'm okay as a writer. Everything until now, everything I've written, there's something that wants me to edit or cringe,
I know.
thing. And they sort of thought I was being, Colin thought I was being sort of falsely modest, and sort of for them to turn to me and say, "Oh no, you're fine." But it was genuine, and I think there's something in writing that is like that. Like to be able to do it, you have to be your own best critic, or worst critic rather. And when the critic finally goes, okay, often the critic shuts up because you have a deadline. But then when you read something you've written before,
Yeah.
And this is the trouble, with Korea Times columns. Your columns are very good. I actually read yours and think, my God, how long did you spend on that? Because they're, newspaper columns are normally, you bang them out, and then you read it the old day, you get and think, oh God, that's not very. But yours are very sort of filled with detail and ideas.
Deadline pushed though. Every week. I don't miss. Yeah. What was it that changed when you felt satisfied? Was there anything you were able to put your finger on?
I don't know. It's partly, it is partly the ideas, or it's basically the ideas or what it is you're trying to say, and then it's the craft. And these things are actually interwoven. I don't know if you found this, but I found when I was first writing, my ideas got pulled along by the words I was, and I couldn't say what I meant and meant what I said, type of thing.
Yeah.
I think there's something. It's very difficult for me to answer this because, as I said earlier, that I'm not someone. I could have got books out and studied this. I have written some books on writing.
Oh, wow.
And this is after I'd been writing for years, so then they mean something. But I never started off doing that. And I sort of picked up things along the way. I mean, a big thing for journalism and in modern writing that is now changing, I noticed, because a lot of online writing is brevity. It's this idea that you take 2 pages of something you've written. Okay, now reduce it to 1, without losing meaning. And there's this sort of Hemingway-esque style comes out where everything is reduced down.
Yeah, snack culture as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think it's also I do my thinking when I'm writing. Oh, I know what I could maybe say is there are a lot of things in life that you don't do to perfection, that you haven't got time to do everything well. I mean, like, I couldn't cook to save myself, but I don't care. Things like that. I never quite know what clothes to wear. My wife tells me, "Oh, that doesn't look good." I buy clothes because they look good in the shop on the mannequin. But then when I put it's like, whereas if I was a real natural fashionista or designer, I'd sort of study, how colours go together. So I've been a bit like that with writing, like my own writing. I'm a terrible judge of other writing. I tend to think that anything that's in print, unless it's obviously bad, or I have tended to think that it's good, and there's so many different ways to write.
There are.
And so I think ultimately what matters is what are the ideas that are being presented, even if they're not presented well. The ideas take precedence over the style, I think. And so I notice now writing that where style, you can admire people for style and then think, what are they actually saying? There's a lot of very obscure writing. Like I read last year, I finally read Ulysses.
Okay.
And I've been an admirer. I did James Joyce for A-level, so I've been an admirer of James Joyce for years. I read Ulysses, but I sort of think now, what is the point of all?
That's the idea of Ulysses. It's the ultimate style over, or Proust and In Search of Lost Time. 1920s approach.
I recently read some novels by American authors that I hadn't heard of before. From the sort of 50s, 60s era. Janet Lewis, John Williams, James Salter. James Salter wrote. He was an Air Force pilot, a fighter pilot in the Korean War. Actually.
Oh wow!
And he wrote a novel about that. He's sort of Hemingway-ish, but his choice of phrase. I mean, he smacks you in the face with the beauty of his sentences. Extraordinary.
John Williams, Stoner.
Yeah.
I picked that up thinking it would be about something else, and it just destroyed me, that book. I just felt so despondent by it.
Just give up.
But that's powerful writing, because I didn't finish it and go, nothing.
Yeah.
It physically affected me, that book.
Yeah, I picked that up in the Kyobo.
Okay.
It must have been republished or something, I forget, but I picked it up recently, and then just sort of Googled about him, and then I got the names of these two other, Janet Lewis, James Salter. So that kind of, and then I sort of think this is the greatest sort of, and then then I'll read something else and think this is. So I think you have to find your own voice. The other thing I read recently, something I thought was kind of very true, but it's like to write well, you have to have courage. In other words, if you ever find yourself editing yourself out of sort of people criticize me. I don't mean like criticize you politically. More like just that's stupid. Yeah. You should check yourself, because it's like, for example, if you have writing that's got too many, however, on the other hand, of course, another way of looking at this is all means you're not very confident in what you're saying. So there needs to be confidence, but at the same time, a person who starts off confident is not going to develop the craft, because you need that little lawyer/editor in your head sitting on your shoulder going, well, that's rubbish.
Sometimes that lawyer/editor is quite large, isn't it? It is quite vocal.
So I'm sorry, I can't really answer the question very well, but it's the other thing is it's something I've always wanted to be good at, and I'm still, you're sort of never satisfied, basically,
I've often said that once I write the perfect column, I'll retire, and I haven't done it yet after however many years of writing a column every week. But what I picked up from you there, Mike, was that I think you have to read. So you read, and you need to read to be able to write.
I was always aware that for years I didn't read. And because, I studied English literature, and English literature at university killed my,
I can imagine.
And what it does, it's worse than killing your desire to read literature. It does that, but at the same time, it makes you guilty reading page turners. Like if you like spy novels or something, you feel guilty. So I finally shed that. It was about 7 or 8 years ago. My son gave me a very, very badly written novel for a Christmas present because it was written by an expat in finance in Hong Kong, and he said, "Dad, do you know this guy?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, he's written a novel here. Happy Christmas." And I read that, and I decided, I opened up a file in the computer when I finished it, put the name of the book and the author, and then I decided to, and that actually pushed me along. So I've been doing it ever since. And I read about 40, 50 books a year, something like that. All sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Last year went through Lord of the Rings, and
you're reading the Bible at the moment, if I remember.
The Bible. I realised that we're all familiar with the Bible, but I'd never in my life, honestly, I don't think once sat down and thought, okay, I'll read through the Bible. Anytime I've read anything biblical, it's sort of come my way as a quote or something like that.
Some good quotes in there to you, some And
so I'm on Joshua now, which is the sixth book in the Bible. And I'm starting the New Testament as well, so I'm sort of doing some parallels. I'm sort of thinking, that's funny, I never read this before. But a lot of it just seems familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there... Reading is one I took from you. Having courage was another one. Having ideas. One of my favourite critics is a gentleman. He owns the Brai Republic in Itaewon. His name is Chris, bald guy, South African guy, and he will tell me if my article's rubbish. 1 week. He's a very good friend of mine, and about a couple of months ago, I wrote this one, and I was a bit scared of it, and I put this paragraph at the top in italics, which was like, "This is just an idea" or something like this. And the Korea Times, they never normally edit my work, but they took that paragraph, took the italics out, put it at the bottom. And so it ended like that. And he phoned me up and he said, "Never do that again. Never apologize for your work. Like, if you write it, but don't defend yourself to the masses or something like that." So there was a similar idea. I think you've got to have courage and mean it.
Well, I'll follow them from now, and I'll give you some feedback.
No, that's petrifying. That's the worst thing I've ever heard. But is there another? But thank you. I do appreciate it. Is there another book in you?
Yes. Well, I'm, being a young fellow, I haven't really arrived in life at what I really want to do, which, since I was young, is to be a novelist. So I've written my first novel, and I won't talk about it because I'm kind of a bit superstitious in that way.
I get that.
I've got 2 more drafted out. Draft in, just the idea, basically. And there is a non-fiction book that I'm working on at the moment. So I'm actually toying with the idea of publishing the novel in Korean, in Korea first, and then doing the English.
Oh, wow.
Partly because this is where I live.
Yeah, I like that.
And partly because, the publishing world, of course you can self-publish, but publishing world is it's not easy, and I'm not sure how interested they'll be in a old white guy writing his first novel, because I think there are thousands of us around with our first and only novel that we finally
at least thousands.
we finally pay the printer to publish ourselves, and then so I thought I might give myself a chance.
Do you have a take on self-publishing? It seems to be coming a thing. I've seen more and more people sort of, because you get it out quickly, you have control over it, you don't have to wait years or something like that. Do you know anything about it or any?
I'm not really familiar with it. I've been quite lucky because the first book I wrote, I was asked, actually 2 other British journalists in Seoul at the time were asked before me, and by a publisher who was doing business books in Asia, and had one on China, one on Japan, both written by journalists, and wanted one on Korea. and they both recommended me because they weren't interested in doing it. So that's how I got my first start, and I appreciated the. I mean, you don't make a lot of money out of it, but it's all there done for you.
Yeah.
And you get the sort of the reputation, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
The book is sort of so. With self-publishing, I would be afraid that I wouldn't move more than 10 copies to my family at Christmas, and that's about it.
Is it a nice feeling walking into Kyobo and while you walk past John Williams, then you see your books on the shelf? I've always wanted to have written a book in the past.
Yeah.
And there you are.
It is these things like that seem sort of really, oh my God, that would be something. You pass them by. I always remember when I got my first passport thinking, I'd love to put occupation writer.
Okay.
This will put me up there with James Joyce and the others I studied at A-level, D.H. Lawrence, and me. And so the first time getting the book in Kyoto was sort of interesting. Now I usually go and check and see if there's any copies in there. And somebody sent me a photo of a lady, this is a couple of years ago, at a tube station in London on the platform, reading my book. And so they
the first one or the second one?
The second one.
Yeah.
So they took a photo of it and sent it to me. And that is kind of, I met Bill Bryson, the author.
Yeah, wow. What a writer he is.
Yeah. And he, actually, I'm just listening to one of his books on audio when I'm driving, Mother Tongue, which I'd read before. It's about the English language. It's really good. Anyway, he was telling me, we were talking about this, and he told me a story where he was on a plane, and his son sort of said, "Dad, the person up there is reading a book," And then the person reading it saw the commotion and then sort of got embarrassed. And so, anyway, he told this story, and I'm sort of thinking, Bill Bryson, but don't you see that? Isn't that like a daily experience?
Right.
So, seeing your book up there, it's all. And then you keep going on to the next one.
Yeah. I'm very happy to hear that there are more books coming.
Yeah.
Whatever they might be. That's exciting. How do you know Bill Bryson? Is it just in literary circles, or is there a personal?
It was actually in the World Cup in 2002. I got a call from was it from him? I think I got an email from him. But he had called the British Embassy. He was commissioned by the Times, London Times, to do a couple of features on Korea just before the World Cup started. Okay. As a sort of opener. Yeah. So he came here and he walked around Seoul and he did a couple of stories. Oh, he did one in here and then one in Japan. Something like that. And so he rang up the embassy and asked I think he asked if they knew how to get in touch with me or something, because he'd read my book. Anyway, it was connected to the book. So that's how it happened. So we met and had some lunch, and then I arranged a dinner for him with sort of half a dozen foreign correspondents in Itaewon, so we had a
good time
with him, yeah.
For anybody listening that doesn't know, the Koreans and the New Koreans both highly recommended. To understand Korea, I'll make sure to link them in this, but I was thinking, I wonder if that woman on the tube station was my mum, because I've sent it to her, and she was. When people ask me, it's one of the first ones that I go for.
But is your mum black and about 25? No, with glasses. With glasses. No. Okay.
No. But would be nice if she were. She's coming over on Monday. She's back over on Monday. So she comes here a lot. That's why I'm not having dinner with you and Colin and Jacko. My apologies. I would love to be there. But mums are mums.
Okay.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. And we're in Gangwon-do. So when I pick her up for the airport, then my kids are out in Gangwon-do. So we stay out there.
Is that what you live out there? Or
kids are out there, and I have a place in Seoul and
School?
go back and
School
forth.
there?
Better school and
Whereabouts are they?
Wonthong, which is next to Inje.
Inje. Oh, Inje.
So Inje, it's in the centre and it's up above the 38 actually.
Yeah. Inje's like what, 2 or 3 hours?
It takes me an hour and 40 minutes.
That's fast. Wow.
Well, if you go at the right time of day, it's an hour and 40. So it's not too bad. It takes me an hour and 40 minutes to get across Seoul sometimes, the wrong time of day. But clean, nice air, and I'm a country boy at heart, and it's good for the kids, I think, for now. And it's not easy to live in Seoul, apartment prices and things like that. It's. I mean, if we were rich, it would be different, but professors don't make a lot of money.
Yeah, no, it's that's a whole nother theme.
Let's close this up with two. Mike, advice for young people. Advice for young people in 20. You said you had a son, so you used to this. I didn't.
I've got 6 kids. Yeah.
You've got 6 kids.
Yeah.
Wow.
4 boys and 2 girls.
What's the difference between the oldest and youngest? I'm sorry, this fascinates me.
From 11 to 30.
Oh, wow.
So,
wow, that's old. So advice then for young people these days. You're the perfect person to ask.
It's not sort of necessarily career specific.
No.
I mentioned earlier about wokeism. I've actually, I'm not looking and reading so much about, I'm kind of letting a lot of what's happening in Korea go by me these days, and I'm really reading up about this because the woke movement and the how politics has become so sort of heavy. Because I'm trying to understand it, because I don't think it's a superficial thing. I think there's some deep sort of new way of thinking that's going to rise up, and maybe might just fade, or it might just die out with a generation, or transform. I can see it could also transform in a radical way. And so I'm trying to get my head around this. And so my advice to people is not to become religious, but the advice is taken from a religious theme, which is that you shouldn't judge people. Don't judge people by. We all know not to judge people by colour. We know not to judge people by gender and other things. But I think we haven't quite got to the point where don't judge people by their opinions, because opinions change. You should always. I think it's kind of seek to find a point where you can develop affection for people, and be tolerant of people who are different from you and who disagree with you. That doesn't mean sort of coddling up to a neo-Nazi and saying, I love your uniform. But because there's nothing wrong with being angry and disagreeing with people. But I mean, it's in a deeper sense. It's about being judgmental, because I think we're sort of headed for some kind of collision in Western society like this, precisely because what people's opinions about politics and things seem to count for more than anything else now.
Yeah.
And I think that's very destructive. And I think Koreans aren't like that. They're very fractious, but often when you're saying something that they disagree with, they might not even be aware they disagree with it. They sort of respond to these things in a different way, and so I think it's something we can learn.
I love the advice, particularly in terms of the way that you say we have learnt not to judge people by the colour of their skin and these things. And I think for the most part we have, and we had to learn that as humans, because maybe we had to unlearn what we'd done or whatever it was. But it's been a rather recent thing in the grand span of Bill Bryson history, if we want to tell those things, right? But do you have any sense of why we are where we are, judging people by opinions? Because you probably remember a time where it was different, and that's why it's interesting to you. That's why it baffles you a little bit. Or do you have any just a sense of how it got there?
I think, I mean, I keep coming back to religion, but I think it's that politics is the new religion for many people. That religious belief in Western countries has really dropped off.
Yeah.
You know, like in Britain, I mean, the fervent belief now, I think, is Islam, the Muslims in Britain. But for a lot of people who grew up, you know, I mean, I grew up in a very agnostic family. My grandparents were Christians. My parents just were Christian in nature, but we never went to church or talked about things like that, you know. But I see it, and so I see it differently. For an individual, that's a different matter. But in a collective sense, if you lose the things that push you to be decent and good, and then, so what are you pursuing then? Are you pursuing money? Are you pursuing fun? You're wanting to get oblivious to things as much as possible? Or are you pursuing power? In which case you have to sort of destroy other people in the process. You know, if you remove that ethic that pushes you to be decent, you know, I think the consequences are not good, and I fear that something like that is. I think we're probably in the West. We're probably in for some kind of revival. You know, these things tend to go in cycles, and I suspect, you know, the hippie movement was a sort of a revival of sorts. It was like love everybody and be nice, but it had no substance to it. You know.
There were lots of substances in the hippie movement.
Well, it had the wrong substances, you know. So I'm kind of curious about all that now, and I'm. But that's what concerns me. What particularly concerns me that this, I say, it seems a bit glib that politics has become the new religion, but people seem to get worked up more about these things than about anything else.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Like, not everybody. I mean, a lot of people don't care.
Right.
But enough people to make enough noise and to fill the newspapers. And see, journalists are really vulnerable to this, and they're some of the perpetrators, I think, because you know, in the old days, to write a story, you have to go and pound the streets or at least phone around. Now you just sort of, you go on Twitter and see what somebody's saying, and you got a story about somebody being offended about something. You know, so this is all feeding this thing, and I don't think it's going to end well.
Seems to be a dichotomy between the importance, how important it feels, but then how trivial at the same time it is. That these things are of such great importance and of such great weight, but then the things that are really important, whether it might be the suicide, the poverty, the mental health, they seem to get lost in that maelstrom where we're all focusing on these political things. I think maybe although religiosity has gone down in terms of attending formal services or worship, I don't think it's correct to describe our societies as irreligious. I think they're very religious in certain ways.
You mean British? Or,
well, I think, you know, whatever societies we might live in Britain and in parts of Europe and in parts of North America, I think you're correct to say that maybe South Korea is a little bit different. A lot of those cultural conversations and questions of identity, they're not here amongst my university students.
I think what I'd say, you're right, actually, is, where did I hear this recently? Someone saying something like, if you get 100 Brits, maybe 10 of them will be churchgoers. But about 90% or 95% will sort of say something, I feel is more to like, or they're sort of spiritual or kind of not sure, agnostic, not quite sure, but so actual atheists may be quite small. But so people aren't, they don't like formal religion so much, but they still think. The thing is that gets pushed down.
Yeah.
You know. And you're right, you don't have it. You don't have that here. Although, you know, more than 50% of Koreans don't identify as belonging to one particular religion or another. But they're more open to that. But then, you know, who doesn't go to the fortune teller sort of thing?
Or change their name because they'll have a better they'll have better luck. I'm changing my name. Okay. That's what they do. They do seem to get on well across the religions here. I think, just to clarify this one point, when I say that although church going or temple attending has decreased, when I say societies are still religious in some way, I don't necessarily just mean it's a belief in spirituality or transcendence, but like you say, politics has become a new religion, or they've become tribal in that sense, and it's performative and it's ceremony, and there are people that they look up to. There's I won't ever believe that I could suggest a book, but there's one by Eric Hoffer. It's called The True Believer. I'm not sure if you've read this. He wrote this in the late 1940s, and Eric Hoffer was just and you read it today and you're like, oh wow. This is, and it's just short paragraphs. It's a full 200-page book, but each one is just like a paragraph like this. And I believe Eric Hoffer was like a worker on the docks or something like this. But he wrote this psychology of movements and where people start believing things, and it's a fascinating account. So.
He was a stevedore all his life or something, and. Yeah.
Sorry, a Steve,
like a dock worker. Or something.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's the book. There might be a group in here afterwards, so we can have it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Great. Nice to see you.
Nice to be seen. Thank you for your time. How was it? Did you enjoy that? 3 hours.
Yeah, it didn't feel like 3 hours. Yeah.
That's a testament to your storytelling, because some of them finish earlier. This one we kept going.